When 16-year-old Mara Hensley was traded for a rifle and $20 in supplies on the dusty steps of Ridgewater's general store, the crowd whispered she'd been bought for cruelty. They watched her climb into Calder Voss's wagon, the silent mountain man with winter in his eyes, and assumed they'd never see her alive again. But what waited in those high pines wasn't punishment. It was something far more dangerous: freedom. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Mara's journey travels. The September sun beat down on Ridgewater's main street with the kind of heat that turned tempers mean and patience thin. Dust hung in the air like a veil, clinging to skirts and boot leather, settling into the creases of hard-worn faces gathered outside Brennan's general store. They'd come for the spectacle, though none would admit it. They'd come to watch Thomas Hensley sell his daughter. Mara stood on the loading platform with her head bowed, fingers twisted in the coarse fabric of her too-small dress. Sweat traced lines down her back. The planks beneath her feet were splintered and sun-warmed, and she focused on the grain of the wood because looking up meant meeting eyes. Dozens of them, some pitying, most merely curious, all certain they knew how the story would end. 16 years old, her father announced, his voice carrying the practiced boom of a man who'd sold livestock at auction all his life. Strong back, good with animals, knows her numbers and letters, courtesy of the schoolmarm before she moved on. Thomas Hensley was a lean man gone to gristle, all sharp angles and harder edges. He stood beside Mara with one hand clamped on her shoulder, not affection, just ownership. His other hand gestured broadly, as if she were a mare he was trying to move before winter set in. "Eats less than you'd think," he added, and a few men in the crowd chuckled. Mara felt the sound like stones against her ribs. She was heavy-set in a world that prized narrow waists and delicate wrists. Her face was round, her arms solid, her body the kind that drew muttered comments from women in Sunday dresses and open scorn from young men who thought cruelty proved their worth. She'd learned early that her shape was a failing in the eyes of Ridgewater, something to be apologized for or hidden away. Her father had made his position clear. She was a burden he could no longer afford. "Any takers?" Thomas scanned the crowd with the false cheer of a desperate man. "I'm asking fair. Provisions, tools, whatever you think square. She'll work hard, won't complain." Silence stretched. Somewhere down the street a horse stamped and blew. A woman shifted her basket from one arm to the other, eyes averted. Mara's throat tightened. She'd known this moment was coming, had felt it building for weeks in the way her father looked through her at dinner, calculated in mutters over his account books. Still, knowing didn't blunt the blade. "Hell, Thomas," someone finally called from the back. "You want us to pay you to take a problem off your hands?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Mara bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. Her father's grip tightened on her shoulder. "She's young and healthy. Any man with a homestead needs help. Any woman with a household could use an extra set of hands." His voice had gone sharp at the edges, desperation leaking through. "I'm offering a fair trade." "Fair for who?" another voice muttered. Then the crowd shifted, parted. A man stepped forward. Mara saw his boots first, worn leather, dusty but well kept, the kind that had seen years of mountain trails. Her gaze traveled up slowly, canvas trousers, a faded shirt rolled to the elbows, broad shoulders that carried themselves with the stillness of someone used to solitude. When she reached his face, she found it weathered and unreadable, carved by wind and sun into something more landscape than expression. His hair was dark, shot through with early gray, pulled back from a face that might have been handsome once, before whatever had happened to hollow out his eyes. Calder Voss. She knew the name, though she'd never spoken to him. Everyone in Ridgewater knew it, the way they knew about storms brewing in distant mountains. Something to be watched, noted, avoided. He lived alone up in the high pines, came down twice a year for supplies, spoke only when necessary. Rumors followed him like smoke, that he'd been a soldier, that he'd killed men, that he'd lost a family in some unnamed tragedy and retreated from the world to nurse his ghosts. The details varied depending on who was telling, but the core remained the same. Calder Voss was a man best left alone. He stopped 3 feet from the platform and looked directly at Mara. His eyes were gray, the color of winter sky before snow. For a long moment, he simply studied her. Not the way her father's customers studied livestock, but the way someone might look at a horizon they were trying to memorize. Then he turned to Thomas. "What are you asking?" Thomas straightened, surprised into salesmanship. "Well now, Mr. Voss, I'd say, straight answer." The words were quiet, but they cut through Thomas's bluster like a knife through cloth. Mara's father cleared his throat. "A rifle. Good one. Repeating if you've got it, and supplies enough for winter, flour, salt, coffee, whatever you think fair on top." Calder nodded once. "Wait here." He walked into Brennan's without another word. The crowd buzzed with fresh speculation. Mrs. Brennan, who ran the store with her husband, appeared in the doorway wringing her hands, her round face creased with distress. She caught Mara's eye and mouthed something that might have been, "I'm sorry," but Mara looked away. Pity was worse than contempt. At least contempt was honest. 5 minutes later, Calder emerged with a rifle in one hand and a burlap sack in the other. He set both on the platform beside Thomas and stepped back. Thomas hefted the rifle, worked the action, held it up to the light. A Winchester, well-maintained, worth more than he'd hoped for. His eyes went greedy. He peered into the sack and found coffee, flour, salt pork, dried beans, sugar, tobacco. "This is generous," Thomas said slowly. "It's what you asked for." "And you're taking her as is? No returns? No complaints?" Calder's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't make complaints about people." Thomas stuck out his hand. "Then we have a deal." They shook, just like that. Mara felt the world tilt beneath her feet, the sun too bright, the crowd's murmurs too loud. She'd been sold, traded like a horse or a plow, her worth measured in flour and tobacco. Calder turned to her. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the careful distance he kept. Not menacing, just deliberate. "Get your things." "I don't—" Her voice came out rough. She swallowed and tried again. "I don't have things." Something flickered in his expression, too quick to name. He nodded toward a wagon hitched at the end of the street. "Then come on." Mara looked at her father one last time. Thomas had already turned away, examining his new rifle, weighing the sack of supplies. He didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, didn't offer any final words. She was a transaction completed, a debt settled. The crowd watched in silence as Mara climbed down from the platform and followed Calder to his wagon. It was a sturdy rig, plain but well made, pulled by 2 dappled horses who shifted at her approach. Calder opened the back and gestured for her to climb in. She hesitated. This was the moment where everything the town whispered might come true. She could run, scream, fight, but where would she go? Back to her father who'd just sold her for a rifle? Into the care of the townspeople who'd stood and watched it happen? Mara climbed into the wagon bed. Calder handed her a folded blanket and a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Bread and cheese, water skins tied to the side if you need it." Then he climbed onto the driver's seat, released the brake, and clicked his tongue. The horses moved forward with an easy gait, and Ridgewater began to fall away behind them. Mara sat with her back against the side of the wagon, the blanket in her lap, the bundle of food in her hands. She didn't unwrap it, couldn't eat. The town disappeared into dust and distance, and with it everything she'd known, the mercantile where she'd once bought penny candy, the schoolhouse where she'd learned to write her name, the church steps where she'd sat during social hours, invisible and alone. None of it had been kind, but it had been familiar. The road climbed steadily upward, leaving the valley behind. Cottonwoods gave way to pine. The air cooled and thinned. Mara watched the landscape change through a blur of unshed tears she refused to let fall. After an hour, Calder glanced back. "You can sit up front if you want. Easier on the spine." She didn't move. He didn't push. Another hour passed. The sun shifted toward afternoon, gilding the tops of the pines. Mara's body ached from the hard wagon bed, but she stayed where she was, the blanket clutched in her hands like armor. Finally, Calder spoke again. His voice was low, barely audible over the creak of the wagon and the steady clip of hooves. "I'm not going to hurt you." Mara stared at the back of his head. The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they settled like stones in her chest. Men said things like that. Men made promises. And then they did whatever they wanted anyway, because who would stop them? She said nothing. Calder's shoulders rose and fell in a slow breath. You don't have to believe me yet. That's all right. They traveled on. The cabin appeared as the sun touched the tops of the western peaks, spilling gold and orange across a small clearing ringed by towering pines. It was larger than Mara had expected. Hewn logs chinked with clay, a stone chimney at one end, a covered porch across the front. A shed stood to the left, and beyond it a small barn. Chickens scratched in a fenced yard. A creek ran somewhere close. She could hear the water moving over stones. Calder brought the wagon to a stop and set the brake. He climbed down, moved to the back, and offered his hand. Mara looked at it, calloused, scarred across the knuckles, steady. She ignored it and climbed down on her own. If Calder was offended, he didn't show it. He simply turned and began unhitching the horses, his movements practiced and efficient. Mara stood in the clearing, the blanket still clutched in her hands, and tried to understand where she was. The silence was enormous. No voices, no wagon wheels, no church bells. Just wind in the pines and the distant murmur of water and the soft sounds of Calder working with the horses. Cabin's open, he said without looking at her. There's a loft. That's yours. I sleep down below. Door doesn't lock from the outside, only the inside. You can bar it if you want. Mara blinked. What? The loft. It's private. You lock it from your side if you feel safer that way. She stared at him. He led the horses toward the barn, still not meeting her eyes, and she realized he was giving her space deliberately, not hovering, not commanding, not even looking. She walked slowly to the cabin and pushed open the door. Inside was simple and clean. A table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth with a kettle hanging over cold ashes. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with jars and tins. A narrow bed sat in the far corner, neatly made. And at the back, a ladder led up to a loft tucked beneath the slanted roof. Mara climbed the ladder on shaking legs. The loft was small but self-contained. A mattress on a low frame, a trunk at the foot, a window that looked out over the pines. A patchwork quilt lay folded at the end of the bed. There was a hook on the wall for clothes, though she had none to hang, and on the inside of the loft's half wall, a simple iron bar rested in 2 brackets, a lock, just as he'd said. She sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at that bar for a long time. Below she heard Calder return, heard him moving around the cabin, building a fire, setting a pot to boil, opening and closing cupboards with quiet care. He didn't call for her, didn't demand she come down and start earning her keep. The smell of cooking beans and salt pork began to fill the cabin. Mara's stomach clenched with hunger, but she stayed where she was, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her mind spinning through every terrible possibility. This was a trap. It had to be. Men didn't buy girls and give them private rooms with locks, didn't offer kindness without expecting payment. But as the evening deepened and the cabin filled with warmth and the scent of simple food, Calder still didn't call for her, didn't come to the base of the ladder, didn't do anything but cook and eat in quiet solitude. Finally, hunger won. Mara climbed down the ladder. Calder sat at the table with a plate in front of him, chewing slowly. He glanced up when she appeared, then gestured to a second plate already prepared and waiting on the other side of the table. Beans and pork. Cornbread's in the pan if you want it. Coffee's hot. Mara approached the table like she was approaching a wild animal, sat down carefully, picked up the spoon. The food was plain but well made, seasoned with salt and a hint of sage. She ate 3 bites, then 4, waiting for the condition, the demand, the moment when kindness curdled into expectation. Calder finished his meal, stood, and carried his plate to a basin by the door. He poured water from a pitcher, washed the plate, set it on a drying rack. Then he turned to her. There's rules if you're staying here. Mara's hand froze halfway to her mouth. Calder leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his face unreadable in the firelight. You do your share of the work, garden, animals, firewood, cleaning. I'll teach you what you don't know. You keep to yourself, I'll keep to myself. The loft is yours, like I said. I don't go up there unless you ask me to, and you don't come into my space unless invited. We eat together, work together, but privacy is sacred, you understand? She nodded slowly. You don't owe me anything beyond fair work. No debts, no obligations past that. If you want to leave, you tell me, and I'll take you wherever you want to go, no questions. But while you're here, you pull your weight and you respect the rules. That clear? Yes. The word came out barely a whisper. Calder studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Good. Finish eating. There's water for washing up when you're done. Morning comes early. He walked to his bed in the corner, sat down to pull off his boots, and turned his back to the room. Within minutes, his breathing had settled into the deep, even rhythm of sleep. Mara sat at the table, her plate half finished, her mind reeling. She'd been bought, traded, taken from everything she knew. And the man who'd done it had given her a room with a lock, a plate of food, and a promise of privacy. She didn't believe it, couldn't afford to. But as the fire burned low and the cabin filled with the soft sounds of night, wind in the pines, the creak of settling logs, Calder's steady breathing, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Space to breathe. She finished her meal in silence, washed her plate as he'd done, and climbed back to the loft. She lay down on the mattress, pulled the quilt over her shoulders, and stared at the ceiling beams. After a long time, she reached out and slid the iron bar into place. The lock clicked home with a soft, final sound. For the first time in 16 years, Mara Hensley fell asleep behind a door only she could open. Morning arrived cold and blue, the sky streaked with high clouds that promised weather. Mara woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, her body stiff from the unfamiliar mattress and the tension she'd carried into sleep. She lay still for a moment, listening. Below, Calder moved through the cabin with the same quiet efficiency she'd noticed the night before. No heavy footsteps, no muttered complaints, just the steady rhythm of a man who'd lived alone long enough to make peace with silence. She climbed down the ladder. Calder glanced up from the stove. Morning, there's oatmeal and bacon. Help yourself. Mara served herself a small portion and sat at the table. Calder joined her with his own plate, and they ate without speaking. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar. In her father's house, meals had been tense affairs, every silence a potential prelude to criticism. Here, silence was just silence. When they'd finished, Calder stood and carried his plate to the basin. I'm checking the trapline this morning. You'll stay here. Get familiar with the place. Chickens need feeding. Grains in the barrel by the coop. Gather eggs if they've laid. Creeks down the path behind the cabin if you need water. Don't wander past the clearing. These woods can turn a stranger around quick. He pulled on a canvas coat, settled a hat on his head, and picked up a rifle from beside the door. Then he paused and looked back at her. You'll be all right? Mara nodded. Calder studied her for a breath longer, then stepped outside. She heard his footsteps cross the porch, fade into the forest, and disappear. She was alone. Mara stood in the center of the cabin, plate in hand, and felt the weight of solitude settle around her like snowfall. No one watching, no one waiting to criticize or correct. No voices, no demands, no eyes tracking her every movement. She set down her plate and walked slowly through the cabin, touching things with tentative fingers. The rough wood of the table, the smooth curve of a tin cup, the iron handle of the stove, still warm from breakfast. Everything was clean, orderly, used but cared for. She opened cupboards and found them neatly stocked. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, sugar, salt. Jars of preserves lined one shelf. Tomatoes, peaches, pickles. A sack of potatoes sat in a cool corner. This wasn't the pantry of a man scraping by. This was the work of someone who planned, who prepared, who thought past the next meal. In the far corner beyond Calder's bed sat a trunk. It was locked, the wood dark with age, the iron fittings showing rust at the edges. Mara stared at it for a long moment, then turned away. Whatever was in there wasn't her business. She washed the breakfast dishes, dried them, put them away. Then she pulled on the 2 small shawls she'd worn from town and stepped outside. The morning was sharp and bright, the air carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Chickens clucked and scratched in their yard. Beyond the clearing, the forest rose in every direction, an ocean of green and shadow. Mara found the grain barrel where Calder had said, scooped a handful, and scattered it in the chicken yard. The birds rushed forward with greedy enthusiasm, pecking and shoving. She scattered more, watched them settle into their breakfast, then opened the small coop door and peered inside. 6 eggs sat in the straw-lined boxes. She gathered them carefully into the hem of her skirt, cradling them as she walked back to the cabin. Inside, she found a bowl and transferred the eggs one by one, marveling at their warmth, their weight, the pale perfection of the shells. When had she last held something this fragile without breaking it? She set the bowl on the table and returned outside. The path to the creek was narrow but well-worn, winding through ferns and over roots slick with moss. She followed the sound of water until she found it, a clear stream running fast over smooth stones, pooling in a deep bend where the bank flattened into gravel. Mara knelt at the edge and dipped her hands into the water. It was cold enough to steal her breath, clean enough to see every pebble on the bottom. She cupped her hands and drank, the water sweet and sharp, tasting of stone and sky. She sat there for a long time, listening to the creek, watching light move through the trees. Her mind felt too full and too empty at once, full of questions, empty of answers. Why had Calder bought her? What did he want? And why, if he wanted something, hadn't he taken it yet? The questions circled without landing. Eventually she returned to the cabin. The day stretched ahead with no tasks assigned, no orders given. She was expected to work, Calder had said, but he hadn't told her what to do beyond feeding chickens and gathering eggs. Mara looked around the cabin and made a decision. She started with the floor, swept it clean of ash and tracked dirt, then scrubbed it with water and a brush she found hanging by the door. She wiped down the table, the chairs, the shelves. She organized the cupboards, rotating older goods to the front. She split kindling for the fire, stacked it neatly beside the hearth. By midday, the cabin gleamed. Mara stood in the center of the room, sweating despite the cool air, and felt something close to satisfaction. She'd made this place better, not because anyone had forced her, but because she could. She ate a simple lunch, bread and cheese, an apple from a barrel in the shed, and then walked the perimeter of the clearing, studying everything Calder had built. The barn was small but solid, housing 2 stalls, a tack room, and a loft for hay. The shed held tools, all clean, and hung in their places. The chicken coop was well constructed, safe from predators. This was the work of a man who understood how to survive alone, who'd built a life with his own hands and maintained it with discipline. Mara returned to the cabin and climbed to the loft. She lay on the mattress and stared at the ceiling, her body tired in a way that felt earned rather than beaten out of her. Outside, the afternoon light shifted toward gold, and in the silence of the high pines, for the first time in her life, Mara Hensley rested without fear. Dit. Calder returned as the sun touched the mountains. Mara heard him before she saw him. The steady crunch of boots on the path, the soft murmur of his voice to the horses as he led them to the barn. She climbed down from the loft and stood by the table, uncertain. Calder entered the cabin, paused, and looked around. His gaze traveled over the swept floor, the clean shelves, the stacked kindling. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or approval. "You've been busy." "I did what needed doing." He nodded slowly. "Appreciate it." He set his rifle by the door and hung his coat on a peg. "Trapline's clear. Saw sign of elk moving through the upper meadow. We'll have venison before snow if the herd stays close." He moved to the basin and washed his hands, scrubbing dirt from beneath his nails with the focus of a man performing ritual. Then he set about making dinner. More beans, cornbread, dried apples stewed with cinnamon. They ate together as the cabin filled with dusk. Calder asked no questions, made no demands for conversation. He simply ate, his movements economical, his face thoughtful. When they'd finished, he washed the dishes and Mara dried them. They worked in companionable silence, the rhythm easy, until Calder spoke. "You did good work today." Mara looked up, startled. Calder didn't meet her eyes, just kept washing. "Place looks better than it has in a while. You've got a steady hand." The words settled over her like warmth from the fire. Not praise exactly, just acknowledgement, recognition, the kind of thing her father had never offered, that the town had never given. "Thank you," she said quietly. Calder nodded. "Tomorrow, I'll show you the garden plot. Needs turning before frost, and the animals need to know your voice if you're going to be handling them regular. All right. He dried his hands on a cloth and turned to face her. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing words. Then he said, I know you don't have reason to trust me yet. That's fair. But I'll tell you straight. I brought you up here because no child should be sold like livestock, and I had the means to stop it, so I did. That's all. Mara stared at him. That's all? That's all. You don't want... She couldn't finish the sentence. Calder's face hardened. No, I don't. And I won't. You're safe here, Mara. I need you to hear that, even if you can't believe it yet. He walked to his bed, sat down, pulled off his boots. Mara stood frozen by the table, her mind spinning. He'd said her name, not girl or you or any of the dismissive terms her father had used. Her name. She climbed to the loft in silence, slid the bar into place, and lay in the darkness. Below, Calder's breathing settled into sleep. And Mara lay awake, staring at the rafters, trying to reconcile the man who'd bought her with the man who'd just promised her safety. She didn't believe him, not yet, but she wanted to. The days fell into rhythm the way water finds its course through stone, slowly at first, then with surprising ease. Mara woke each morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of Calder moving through the cabin with that same deliberate quiet, as if noise itself was something to be used sparingly. She learned to read his movements. The way he paused at the door before heading out meant he was checking weather. The way he set his coffee cup down with care meant he was thinking through the day's work. The way he sharpened his knife by the fire at night meant he'd be hunting come morning. She learned the cabin's rhythms, too. The way the floorboards creaked near the hearth, the draft that came through the east window when the wind shifted, the particular angle of afternoon light that meant it was time to bring the chickens in. Small things, but they added up to something that felt almost like belonging. On the third morning, Calder took her to the garden plot behind the cabin. It was larger than she'd expected, maybe 30 feet square, bordered by stones and surrounded by chicken wire to keep out deer. The soil was rich and dark, still holding the last of summer's heat. We'll turn this today, Calder said, handing her a spading fork. Get it ready for spring planting. Ground needs to rest through winter, but it rests better if you work the old roots out first. Let the freeze break down what's left. He demonstrated, driving the fork deep and lifting, turning the soil in practiced chunks. Mara watched, then mimicked his movements. The work was hard, harder than sweeping or washing dishes, and within an hour her shoulders burned and her hands had raised fresh blisters. But Calder worked beside her without comment, matching her pace, and she found herself pushing through the pain rather than stopping. They worked until midday when the sun climbed high enough to turn the work brutal. Calder straightened, wiped his brow, and nodded toward the cabin. That's enough for now. We'll finish tomorrow. Inside, he set out bread and cold venison, poured water from the pitcher. They ate standing at the counter, too tired to bother with sitting. Mara's hands trembled as she lifted the cup, the blisters already weeping. Calder noticed. He set down his bread, walked to a shelf, and returned with a small tin. Give me your hands. She hesitated. It's salve. Calendula and beeswax. Keeps blisters from going bad. Slowly, Mara extended her hands. Calder opened the tin and scooped out a small amount of the yellow salve, then applied it to her palms with surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers careful around the raw skin. The salve was cool and smelled faintly of honey and herbs. You'll build calluses, he said, not looking at her face. Takes a few weeks, but then the work gets easier. Does it? The question came out sharper than she'd intended. Calder's mouth quirked, not quite a smile, but close. The work stays the same. You get stronger, feels like easier. He capped the tin and set it on the table. Use that every night before sleep. Morning too, if the skin cracks. Why are you doing this? The words escaped before Mara could stop them. Calder went still. Doing what? Being kind. Teaching me things. You could just... She gestured vaguely, unable to articulate the dozen ways he could have made this different, worse. You don't have to. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the window, the forest beyond. When he spoke, His voice was low and deliberate, each word chosen with care. Had a daughter once. She'd be about your age now, if she'd lived. He paused, and Mara saw his jaw tighten. She deserved better than what the world gave her. So do you. That's reason enough. Before Mara could respond, he turned and walked outside, leaving her standing in the cabin with her salve-slicked hands and 1,000 questions she didn't know how to ask. That night, she lay in the loft and thought about what he'd said. Had a daughter. Not have. The past tense sat heavy in the silence. She thought about the locked trunk in the corner, the way Calder sometimes stared at the fire with eyes that saw things she couldn't, the careful distance he kept even when working side by side. He was haunted. That much was clear. But unlike the ghosts her father had carried, bitterness, resentment, cruelty, Calder's ghost seemed to make him gentler, not harder, as if loss had taught him to be careful with what remained. Mara pulled the quilt up to her chin and listened to the night sounds. Wind in the pines, the creek's constant murmur, the soft hoot of an owl somewhere close. For the first time since arriving, she let herself consider the possibility that this might be real, that Calder might actually mean what he said, that safety might not be a trap waiting to spring. She fell asleep with the salve tin clutched in one hand, the scent of calendula and beeswax mixing with pine smoke and mountain air. The next week brought the first frost. Mara woke to find the world transformed, every blade of grass edged in silver, the chicken water frozen solid, her breath visible in the cold air of the loft. She dressed quickly, layering on the spare shirt Calder had left folded at the foot of the ladder, and climbed down to find him already stoking the fire. "Winter's coming early," he said by way of greeting. "We'll need to move faster. Plenty to do before snow." He taught her to split wood that morning, showing her how to read the grain, where to place the wedge, how to let the maul's weight do the work instead of forcing it. She split half a cord by noon, her shoulders screaming but her technique improving with each swing. Calder stacked as she split, building neat rows under the shelter of the porch overhang. "Good," he said when they'd finished. "You've got the hang of it." The praise was simple, unadorned, but it settled into Mara's chest like warmth from the fire. In the afternoons, he taught her to handle the horses, how to approach without startling, how to read their ears and eyes, how to curry them properly and check their hooves for stones. The dappled mare, Ash, was gentle and patient. The darker gelding, Flint, was more reserved but responded well to quiet confidence. "They'll need to trust you," Calder said, watching as Mara ran the curry comb over Ash's flank. "Come winter, I might need you to handle them on your own if I'm out long. They're good animals, but they're prey animals too. They spook at what they don't know." "How do I make them know me?" "Same way anything else. Consistency. Show up every day, treat them fair, don't ask more than they can give. Eventually, they'll understand you're safe." Mara wondered if he was still talking about horses. By the end of the second week, she could feed and water the animals without supervision, gather eggs and repair the fence where wind had loosened a post, carry water from the creek without spilling. Her hands had indeed grown calluses, the blisters hardening into tough skin that no longer burned with every task. Her body was changing too, growing stronger, moving with more certainty, taking up space in a way she'd never been allowed to before. One evening, as she helped Calder prepare dinner, peeling potatoes while he dressed a rabbit he'd snared, she asked a question that had been building for days. "Why do you live up here alone?" Calder's knife paused mid-cut. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Then he set down the knife and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Tried living down in the world," he said slowly. "After the war, after I lost my family. Tried working in town, being around people, doing what you're supposed to do. But everywhere I went, I kept seeing them, my wife, my daughter, in doorways, in windows, in the way light hit a woman's hair or a child laughed, ghosts everywhere." He picked up the knife again, resumed his work. "Up here, there's just what's real. Trees, water, animals. They don't pretend to be something they're not. Don't ask questions I can't answer. It's simpler." "Doesn't it get lonely?" "Lonely's different than alone. Alone is peaceful. Lonely is when you're surrounded by people and still feel like you're the only one in the room." He glanced at her. "You know what I mean." Mara did. She thought of Ridgewater's Sunday socials standing in corners while laughter happened around her. The schoolhouse where other girls whispered and giggled while she sat apart. Her father's table where she'd eaten in silence, a ghost in her own home. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I know." They finished preparing dinner in comfortable silence. As they ate, Mara found herself studying Calder's face, the deep lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his hair, the careful way he chewed, as if even eating required thought. He was probably 40, maybe younger but aged by hardship, handsome in a weathered way, like a cliff face shaped by wind and time. How did they die? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Calder's fork stilled halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully. When he spoke, his voice was flat, distant, as if reciting someone else's story. Fire. During the war. There was a raid. Confederate irregulars, or maybe just bandits using the war as excuse. They came through burning Union sympathizers' homes. I was away, scouting with my unit, came back to ashes. He stared at his plate. Found them in what used to be the bedroom. Sarah had tried to get Clara out. Almost made it to the window. The air in the cabin felt too thin. Mara's throat closed around words that wouldn't help, wouldn't change anything. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Me too." Calder picked up his fork again, though he didn't eat. "That's why I don't have patience for men who trade their children like livestock. Why I couldn't stand there and watch your father do what he did without stepping in. Some things you can't let pass, even if it's not your business. It became your business when you bought me." "No." He looked at her directly, his gray eyes steady. "It became my business when I saw a child being sold and remembered what it feels like to lose one. The buying was just the means." Mara felt something crack open in her chest, some small, guarded place that had stayed locked since her mother died, since her father started looking at her like a burden to be shed. She blinked hard against the sting of tears. "Thank you," she managed. Calder nodded once, then returned to his meal. They finished eating without further words, but the silence felt different now, weighted with shared understanding, with the kind of honesty that didn't require explanation. That night, for the first time, Mara didn't slide the bar into place on the loft door. She left it open, a small gesture of trust, and fell asleep to the sound of Calder moving quietly below, banking the fire and settling into his own rest. 3 weeks into her time at the cabin, a visitor arrived. Mara was hanging laundry on the line stretched between two pines when she heard the jingle of harness and the steady clop of hooves. She froze, uncertain, then saw Calder emerge from the barn and walk toward the approaching rider with his rifle cradled casually in one arm, ready but not raised. The rider was a woman, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, sitting astride a sturdy paint horse with the ease of someone born in the saddle. She wore men's trousers, a canvas coat, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded a face lined with years and weather. As she drew closer, Mara saw kind eyes, sharp and assessing, and a mouth that looked accustomed to smiling. "Calder Voss," the woman called as she reined in her horse. "I heard you'd gone and done something foolish." "Nell Rowan." Calder's voice carried the faintest hint of warmth. "Didn't know minding my own business counted as foolish." "Depends on whose business you're minding." Nell swung down from her horse with surprising grace and turned to look directly at Mara. "You must be the girl from Ridgewater. Mara, isn't it?" Mara nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look. Hair pulled back in a simple braid, wearing one of Calder's old shirts over her dress, hands still rough from work despite the salve. Nell crossed the clearing and stopped a respectful distance away. "I'm Nell Rowan. I live about 10 miles south, help folks with birthing and healing when they need it. Heard through the grapevine that Calder had brought someone up from town. Thought I'd ride by and make sure everything was all right." "Everything's fine," Mara said, though her voice sounded uncertain even to her own ears. Nell's eyes sharpened. "That's so. Mind if I see your hands?" Mara glanced at Calder, who nodded slightly. She extended her hands, palms up. Nell took them gently, examining the calluses, the fading blisters, the rough but healing skin. "Been working hard," Nell observed. "Eating regular?" "Yes, ma'am." "Sleeping all right? No one bothering you?" "I sleep in the loft. It has a lock." Nell released Mara's hands and looked at Calder, who stood a few paces back, his expression carefully neutral. Something passed between them, some silent communication Mara couldn't quite read. "All right then," Nell said. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Brought you some things? Needle and thread, spare fabric, buttons. Figured you might need them." She pressed the bundle into Mara's hands, then lowered her voice. "You ever need help, for any reason, you walk south following the creek. About 2 hours on foot, you'll hit a meadow with 3 white birches. My cabin's just beyond. Day or night, you come knock. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Nell squeezed her shoulder once, then turned to Calder. "Walk with me a minute." They moved toward the barn, speaking in low tones Mara couldn't hear. She stood holding the bundle, watching as Nell gestured firmly, and Calder listened with his arms crossed. Whatever Nell was saying, it was pointed, and Calder was taking it seriously. After a few minutes, they returned. Nell swung back into her saddle and looked down at Mara. "You seem like a smart girl. Keep your wits about you, do your share, and don't let anyone tell you what you're worth. You decide that for yourself, hear me?" "Yes, ma'am." Nell tipped her hat to Calder. "I'll check back in a month." "Keep her safe, Voss, or I'll come for you with more than words." "Wouldn't expect anything less," Calder said. Nell rode out the way she'd come, disappearing into the trees with a jingle of tack and the soft thud of hooves on pine needles. Mara watched until she was gone, then looked at Calder. "What did she say to you?" "Reminded me that the whole territory is watching, that if I do anything to hurt you, there won't be a rock big enough to hide under." He met her eyes. "She's protective, got a sharp tongue and a sharper sense of right and wrong, but she's fair. She believed you, that I'm safe here. She believed me. But she'll verify for herself next time she comes. Nell doesn't take anyone's word without checking the facts." He gestured toward the bundle in Mara's hands. "She's good people. If you ever need help and I'm not around, you go to her like she said." Mara nodded slowly, turning the bundle over in her hands. Inside, she found not just sewing supplies, but also a small jar of honey, a twist of dried herbs, and a folded piece of paper with neat handwriting. "You're not alone." That night, she sat on the porch while Calder cleaned his rifle by lantern light. The stars were impossibly bright, the air sharp with the promise of coming snow. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and another answered. "Do you think she'll tell people in town?" Mara asked. "That I'm all right?" Calder looked up from his work. "Probably. Nell talks to traders, travelers, anyone passing through. Word'll spread." "Will my father come looking for me?" The question had haunted her since she'd arrived, lurking in the back of her mind like smoke. Calder set down the rifle and leaned back in his chair. "Might. He sold you fair in his eyes, but men like that sometimes get regrets. Not for what they did, but for what they didn't get out of it. If he comes, I'll handle it." "How?" "By telling him the truth, that you're working off your keep, that you're treated fair, and that he's got no claim on you anymore. He took payment, transaction's done." "And if he doesn't accept that?" Calder's face hardened. "Then he'll learn I'm not a man who gives back what's mine to protect." The word should have frightened her, the possessiveness implied, the potential for violence. But instead, Mara felt something settle in her chest. Not fear. Security. The knowledge that someone was willing to stand between her and harm, not because they owned her, but because they'd chosen to. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," she said quietly. "I thought I would be. Thought I'd spend every day waiting for him to show up. But I'm not." "Good. Fear's useful when there's real danger, but there's no sense carrying it when it's just weight." Calder picked up his rifle again, resumed cleaning. "You're safe here, Mara. I meant what I said that first night, no matter how long it takes you to believe it." Mara watched the stars turn slowly overhead and thought about belief, about trust, about the slow accumulation of days that built into something resembling peace. She wasn't there yet, not fully, but she could see it from here, like a distant ridge growing clearer as she climbed. The following week brought the first snow. It fell overnight, soft and silent, transforming the world into something clean and new. Mara woke to white light filtering through the loft window and climbed down to find Calder already dressed, pulling on heavy boots. "Storm's passing, but there will be more behind it. We need to check the animals, make sure the roof's clear, Bring in extra wood." They worked through the morning in companionable rhythm. The snow was ankle-deep in the clearing, deeper where it had drifted against the barn. The chickens huddled in their coop, ruffled and disgruntled. The horses stood calm in their stalls, breath steaming in the cold air. Mara carried armloads of wood from the pile to the porch, her boots crunching through fresh powder, her breath clouding. The work was hard but satisfying. Each task completed a small victory against the season. By midday, the cabin was warm and stocked, the animals tended, the world outside a study in white and green and gray. Calder made soup, venison and root vegetables, thick and rich, and they ate it with fresh bread, standing by the fire to ward off the chill. "You did good today," Calder said, wiping his bowl with the last of his bread. "Kept pace, didn't complain. You're getting stronger." "I feel it," Mara admitted. "Everything still hurts, but different, like I'm using muscles that were asleep before." "That's exactly what's happening. Body's waking up to what it can do." He set his bowl aside. "You keep at it. Come spring, you'll be able to outwork most men I know." The compliment caught her off guard. "You really think so?" "I don't say things I don't mean." Mara looked down at her hands, calloused now, capable, marked by work. They didn't look like the hands that had served food in her father's kitchen, soft and idle and ashamed. These were different hands, stronger, her own. "Thank you," she said, "for teaching me." "You're doing the learning. I'm just pointing the way." That afternoon, while Calder repaired a section of fence the snow had weighted down, Mara found herself drawn to the locked trunk in the corner of the cabin. She'd avoided it deliberately for weeks, respecting the boundary it represented. But now, with snow falling outside and Calder safely occupied, curiosity pulled at her. She knelt beside it and ran her fingers over the dark wood, the rusted iron. It was beautifully made, older than the cabin, the kind of thing that had traveled distances and held important things. She didn't try to open it, wouldn't have even if she could. But she let herself wonder what was inside. Letters, maybe. Clothes. A child's toy. The remnants of a life that had ended in fire and smoke. "Belonged to my wife." Mara jerked back, startled. She hadn't heard Calder return. He stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his face unreadable. "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to—" "I know." He crossed to the trunk and stood looking down at it, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "Haven't opened it since I brought it here. Can't seem to, but can't get rid of it either, so it just sits." "What's in it?" "Her things. Clara's things. Some letters, a few dresses, a quilt Sarah was making. The smell of them probably, if anything's left." His voice was quiet, distant. "Sometimes I think I should burn it. Put it all to rest proper, but then I think that's all that's left of them, and I can't." Mara stood slowly. "You don't have to explain." "I know, but you asked, and you've earned honest answers." He looked at her directly. "We all carry things we can't let go. Some of them we lock in trunks. Some we carry in our heads. Either way, they're heavy. Best we can do is make sure they don't crush us." He walked to the fire and began building it up for the evening, the conversation apparently over. Mara climbed to the loft and sat on her bed, thinking about locked trunks and the weight of memory, about the things people carried and the way grief could make a man gentle instead of cruel. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in silence. That night, Calder taught her to play chess. He brought out a worn board and hand-carved pieces, set them up on the table between their dinner plates, and patiently explained the moves. Mara had never played before, had never been taught games, never been offered that kind of leisure. She lost the first 3 games quickly, barely understanding strategy. But by the 4th game, she'd begun to see patterns, to think ahead, to understand that the goal wasn't just to attack, but to control space, to create possibilities. "You're learning," Calder said, studying the board. "You see 3 moves ahead now. That's good. How many do you see?" "Depends on the game, sometimes 3, sometimes 10. The trick is knowing which moves matter and which are just noise." "Is that from the war, learning to think ahead?" His knight took her bishop. "War teaches you to plan, but it also teaches you that plans fall apart first time they meet reality. So you learn to think on your feet, adapt, survive. Chess is cleaner. You can see all the pieces, know all the rules. Real life's messier. Mara moved her rook, protecting her king. Do you miss it? The war? No. The answer was immediate, firm. Miss some of the men I served with. Miss the clarity of knowing who the enemy was, what we were fighting for. But the killing, the chaos, the waste? No. Don't miss that at all. They played in silence for a while, the only sounds, the click of pieces on wood and the crackle of the fire. Eventually, Calder's queen cornered Mara's king, and the game ended. Better, he said, setting the pieces back in their starting positions. You're thinking like a player now, not just moving pieces. Want to go again? They played until the fire burned low and exhaustion pulled at Mara's eyes. She won the last game, barely, by a narrow margin that felt more like Calder's teaching than her skill, but the victory still settled warm in her chest. Not bad, Calder said, putting the pieces away. Keep that up, you'll be beating me fair by spring. Mara climbed to the loft and lay beneath the quilt, her mind turning over the day, the snow, the work, the locked trunk, the chess game. The pieces of her new life fitting together slowly, forming a picture she was only beginning to understand. Below, Calder moved through his evening routine, and for the first time since arriving, Mara realized she wasn't counting days until escape, wasn't planning how to leave, where to go, how to survive alone. She was simply here, present, building calluses and strength and something that might eventually feel like home. Sleep came easy, dreamless, deep. Winter deepened through November, each storm layering snow until the world became a study in white and shadow. The clearing shrank as drifts piled against the barn, and the chicken coop disappeared except for the path Calder and Mara carved each morning. Inside the cabin, life contracted to the warm circle of firelight, to steam rising from coffee cups, to the steady rhythm of work and rest that marked the passing days. Mara grew stronger. The girl who'd climbed into Calder's wagon with trembling hands and hunched shoulders had begun to straighten, to fill space without apology. She could split a morning's worth of kindling without stopping, haul water buckets that would have defeated her a month ago, and manage the horses with quiet confidence that made even Flint nuzzle her shoulder when she entered the barn. The change showed in more than muscle. Her face had lost the pinched, hunted look she'd worn in Ridgewater. Color had returned to her cheeks. She met Calder's eyes when they spoke now, held her ground in their chess games, even argued with him once about the proper way to stack firewood, and won, because her method actually did shed water better than his. One morning, in early December, Calder announced they were going down to the valley. There's a gathering, he said over breakfast, his tone carefully neutral. Happens twice a year, before winter sets in hard and again in spring. Folks from the mountain homesteads come together, trade goods, share news. We should go. Mara's stomach clenched. I don't need to go. I'm fine here. I know you're fine here, but you can't hide forever. World exists beyond this clearing, and you're part of it whether you want to be or not. He poured more coffee, his movements deliberate. Besides, Nell will be there. She'll have questions if I show up alone. What kind of gathering? Nothing fancy. Old Elias running Fox hosts it on his land. He's got a big barn and some pasture. People bring what they can spare, take what they need. There's food, music sometimes, lots of talking. Mostly it's just neighbors checking on neighbors. Will people from Ridgewater be there? Some might ride out, but it's mostly mountain folk, different crowd. Calder met her eyes across the table. I won't force you, but I think you should come. Let people see you're alive and well. Stop the rumors before they grow teeth. Mara thought about Ridgewater, about the eyes that had watched her stand on that loading platform, about the whispers that must have followed Calder's wagon up the mountain road. She thought about her father, about whether news of her had reached him, about what stories he might be spreading. All right, she said finally. I'll go. They left 2 days later, the wagon loaded with goods to trade, smoked venison, cured pelts, a crate of eggs packed in straw, and several jars of the preserves Calder had put up in summer. Mara wore the best of her limited clothing, the dress Nell had brought on her visit, with one of Calder's coats over it against the cold. Her hair was braided and pinned, her hands scrubbed clean despite the calluses. The journey took most of the morning, the wagon following narrow tracks that wound down through pine forests and across frozen meadows. The world was beautiful in its winter stillness, each branch etched in frost, each clearing pristine with unmarked snow. They passed other cabins tucked into the landscape, smoke rising from chimneys, but saw no one until they crested a final ridge and the valley opened below. Elias. Running Fox's land spread across a wide hollow where three creeks converged, protected from the worst winds by surrounding hills. The barn was indeed large, built from honey-colored logs with a roof that curved slightly in a way that suggested careful craftsmanship. Wagons clustered around it, horses tied to fence rails, and smoke rose from several fire pits where people gathered. As they descended, Mara counted maybe 40 people, men, women, children of various ages, their clothing a mix of homespun and store-bought, their faces weathered by outdoor lives. These weren't townfolk in their Sunday best. These were people who understood snow and isolation, who measured wealth in seed stores and livestock, who knew what it meant to depend on neighbors when the nearest doctor was a day's ride away. Calder guided the wagon to an open space near the barn and set the brake. Before they could climb down, Nell appeared, striding across the snowy ground with her characteristic energy. "There you are," she called. "Was starting to think you'd hold up for the season." Her sharp eyes found Mara. "And you brought her. Good." Mara climbed down from the wagon, acutely aware of eyes turning her direction, conversations pausing. Nell didn't seem to notice or care. She linked her arm through Mara's with easy familiarity and steered her toward the barn. "Come on, there's hot cider and about 15 women dying to meet you, though they're too polite to mob you all at once." "Nell, you don't have to do anything except stand there and be civil. I'll handle the rest." Nell squeezed her arm. "Trust me, these are good people. They just want to see that you're all right." Inside the barn, long tables had been set up, laden with food, roasted meats, root vegetables, fresh bread, pies and cakes, jars of honey and preserves. People clustered in groups, talking and laughing, while children ran between the adults playing some complicated game involving a ball made of tightly wound yarn. Nell led Mara to a group of women standing near one of the tables. They ranged in age from barely older than Mara to weathered grandmothers, their faces curious but not unkind. "This is Mara Hensley," Nell announced. "She's staying with Calder Voss up on the North Ridge. Mara, this is Sarah Colton, Mary Dancing Hawk, Elizabeth Grant, and Ruth Kimball." The women murmured greetings. Sarah, a sturdy woman with flour on her apron, stepped forward and took Mara's hands in her own work-roughened ones. "We heard what happened in Ridgewater," she said quietly. "Heard your father sold you. That true?" Mara felt heat rise in her face, but she met Sarah's eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "And Calder Voss bought you?" "Yes, ma'am." Sarah studied her face, then her hands, noting the calluses, the evidence of work. "He treating you fair?" "Better than fair." "You sleeping in your own space? Eating regular? Got clothes and what you need?" "Yes to all of it. He's been—" Mara paused, searching for words. "He's been kind. Teaching me things. I help with the homestead, but it's real work, not servitude." The women exchanged glances. Mary Dancing Hawk, an older woman with silver-streaked black hair, spoke next. "Calder Voss is a hard man to read. Lost his family in the war, keeps to himself, doesn't talk much. But the few times he's come to these gatherings, he's been honorable. Never seen him treat anyone poorly. My husband says he's one of the best shots in the territory," Elizabeth added. "Says he could have made trouble during the war if he'd wanted, but he just did his duty and came home." "Coming home doesn't erase what war does to a man," Ruth said, her voice carrying a note of caution. "My brother came back different, quieter, more likely to startle, less likely to trust." "Calder startles easy," Mara admitted. "Sleeps light, keeps his rifle by the door. But he's never raised his voice to me, never raised a hand. Just teaches me how to do things and expects me to do them." Nell nodded with satisfaction. "That matches what I've seen. Girl's hands show honest work. She's put on weight in a healthy way, and she looked me straight in the eye when I asked hard questions. If Calder was mistreating her, I'd know." Sarah released Mara's hands and smiled. "Then welcome. We don't stand on ceremony much out here, but we do look after our own. You need anything, fabric for sewing, seeds for spring planting, help with preserving or any woman's work, you send word. The tension Mara had been carrying eased slightly. Thank you. The women shifted into easier conversation, drawing Mara into discussions about winter stores and recipes, about children and weather predictions, about the small details of mountain life. It wasn't comfortable exactly. Mara still felt like an outsider, still caught herself waiting for judgment or mockery. But it wasn't hostile either. These women knew hardship, knew what it meant to survive in difficult circumstances. They recognized the same in her. Across the barn, Calder stood with a group of men examining a saddle someone had brought to trade. Mara watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he kept one shoulder to the wall, the way his gaze periodically swept the room, old habits from his soldier days probably. When his eyes found hers, he offered the smallest nod, checking, making sure she was all right. She nodded back. After a while, an older man with white hair and deeply lined copper-brown skin approached Calder's group. He moved with careful dignity, his steps measured, his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to respect. The other men quieted when he arrived. "Elias," one of them greeted. "Hell of a spread you put together." "My wife deserves the credit. I just make sure the barn stays standing." Elias's voice was gravelly but warm. He turned to Calder and extended his hand. "Voss, good to see you again." They shook, and Mara saw something pass between them. Recognition, maybe, or mutual respect earned in ways she didn't understand. "Heard you brought a girl up from Ridgewater," Elias continued. "That her over there with the women?" "Yes, sir." "Thomas Hensley's daughter?" "Was. Not anymore." Elias studied Mara from across the barn, his gaze thoughtful. "Heard about that business. Shameful thing, selling a child. You did right, stepping in. Did what seemed necessary. Sometimes that's all a man can do." Elias paused. "You understand people are watching? That folks will talk?" "Let them talk. I know what's true." "And if Thomas comes looking for her? If he decides he made a bad bargain and wants to renegotiate?" Calder's jaw tightened. "Then he'll find the bargain's closed. I paid fair. She stays." "He might bring law with him. Claim you're holding her against her will, or worse." "She can speak for herself. Any lawman with eyes can see she's working, not imprisoned. And my land's north of the treaty line. County sheriff's got no jurisdiction up there unless I invite him." Elias nodded slowly. "Good. You've thought it through, but be careful, Voss. Men like Hensley don't like losing face. They'll twist facts to suit their pride. If trouble comes, you send word. There's support to be had if you need it." "Appreciate that." The conversation shifted to other topics, hunting conditions, timber prices, news from the territorial capital. But Mara had heard enough. Calder had been planning for this, thinking ahead to the possibility of her father coming for her. And these mountain people, these neighbors she'd just met, were already circling to offer protection. The gathering continued through the afternoon. Food was shared, goods traded. Music started when someone produced a fiddle and others joined with a banjo and harmonica. Children danced while adults clapped and stomped. The barn filled with warmth and noise, with the kind of community Mara had never experienced. Not performance or judgment, just people being together because winter was long and companionship mattered. As evening approached and people began preparing to leave, Elias sought out Mara directly. He stopped a respectful distance away and inclined his head. "Miss Hensley, I'm Elias Running Fox. This is my land." Mara straightened her spine. "Thank you for having us, sir. You're welcome here anytime, and I want you to know something." He spoke quietly. His words meant only for her. "My people have some understanding of what it means to be treated as property, to have your worth measured by what others can take from you. It's a particular kind of violence, being sold, but it doesn't define you. Only you define yourself." Tears stung Mara's eyes. "Thank you. If you ever need sanctuary, for any reason, my home is open. My wife and I have raised 7 children, buried 2, and we know the difference between a girl who's been rescued and one who's been taken. You were rescued. Don't let anyone tell you different." He touched his hat and moved on, leaving Mara standing in the barn with her throat tight and her eyes burning. Nell appeared at her elbow, pressing a cup of warm cider into her hands. Drink that before you cry. Crying's fine, but do it with something warm in your belly." Mara laughed wetly and sipped the cider. It was sweet and spiced, tasting of apples and cinnamon and the particular kindness of strangers who offered comfort without demanding explanation. The ride home was quiet, both of them tired from the day's socializing. The wagon creaked through darkness, lit only by stars and a rising moon, the horses finding their way with steady confidence. Mara sat bundled in blankets, her mind full of faces and voices, of the way Sarah Colton had squeezed her hands, of Elias Running Fox's quiet dignity, of the women who'd welcomed her without reservation. "That wasn't as terrible as I thought," she said finally. Calder glanced over at her, his face shadowed. "People surprise you sometimes." They were kind. They're practical. Life's hard enough up here without making enemies of neighbors. Besides, most of them have been where you are. Maybe not sold, but cast out or running from something. They recognize their own. "Is that why you came here? Because you were running?" "Partly. Ran from grief, from memories, from a world that felt too loud and too cruel. Found peace in the quiet." He was silent for a moment, then added, "But I'm not running anymore. This is home now, and you're part of it, if you want to be." Mara pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders. "I think I might." They reached the cabin near midnight, the clearing silver with moonlight and fresh snow. Calder tended the horses while Mara rekindled the fire and set water to heat. They moved through the familiar evening routine, checking animals, stoking heat, preparing for the night, with the easy coordination of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. As Mara climbed the ladder to the loft, Calder spoke from his corner of the cabin. "You did good today. Handled yourself well. I'm proud of you." The words settled over her like the quilt she pulled up to her chin. Proud. When had anyone last said they were proud of her? When had she last done anything that warranted pride? She fell asleep thinking about Elias's words, about defining herself, about the difference between being taken and being rescued, about how sometimes the same action could be both, depending on what came after. 3 days later, the warning came. Mara was in the barn grooming Ash when she heard the jingle of harness bells. A signal Calder had taught her meant friendly approach. She stepped out into the cold afternoon and saw a rider coming fast up the trail, snow flying from the horse's hooves. It was a young man she recognized from the gathering, Jacob Kimball, Ruth's son. He reined in hard at the clearing's edge, his horse blowing steam, his face tight with urgency. "Calder here?" he called. "In the shed." Mara pointed, and Jacob rode that direction without dismounting. She followed, arriving just as Calder emerged, saw Jacob's expression, and went still. "What happened?" "Riders came through this morning, asking questions. 3 of them, your girl's father, a man claiming to be a county sheriff, and a deputy. They're saying you took her illegal, that she's being held against her will, that they've got papers to bring her back." Calder's face went flat and hard. "Papers. Forged, most likely. My ma took a look when they stopped at our place. Said the signatures looked wrong, too clean. But they're official looking enough to convince anyone who doesn't look close." "Where are they now?" "Camped at Miller's Creek, about 6 miles south. Said they're heading up here first light tomorrow to liberate the girl from captivity." Jacob's voice dripped scorn on the last words. "Figured you'd want warning." "Appreciate it." Calder's mind was already working. Mara could see it in the way his gaze went distant, calculating. "They say anything about bringing more men?" "Just the 3, but that sheriff's armed heavy. Rifle, 2 pistols, knife. Deputy too. Your girl's father's carrying a shotgun and looking mean." Calder nodded once. "You ride safe back. Tell your mother I'm grateful." "She said to tell you Elias knows, said if you need help, send word." Jacob tipped his hat to Mara. "Miss." Then he was gone, disappearing back down the trail at the same urgent pace he'd arrived. Mara stood frozen in the doorway of the shed, her heart hammering. Her father was coming. Coming with men and guns and papers that said she belonged to him, that Calder was a criminal, that everything she'd built here was a lie. Calder turned to her, his soldier's face in place, calm, focused, deadly serious. "We need to talk." Inside. In the cabin, he paced while she sat at the table, her hands knotted together. "They'll come tomorrow morning. 3 armed men with forged papers and bad intentions. That sheriff's probably on your father's payroll. There's no county jurisdiction up here, so either he's corrupt or he's got some private arrangement. What do we do? First, you need to understand something. If they take you, they'll bring you back to your father's place. Lock you up probably. Use you however they see fit to punish me for interfering. It won't be pretty. Mara's throat closed. I won't go. You might not have a choice. 3 armed men against 1, those aren't good odds, even for me. He stopped pacing and faced her. But I'm not giving you up without a fight, and I'm not fighting alone. What do you mean? I mean we're leaving, tonight. We're going to Elias's place where there's safety in numbers and witnesses if things turn ugly. Your father wants to claim you, he can do it in front of half the mountain folk in this territory. But the cabin, the animals. Animals can survive 2 days on their own if we leave extra feed. Cabin's not going anywhere. But you might, if we stay here isolated. His voice gentled slightly. Mara, I promised you'd be safe. That means making hard choices when trouble comes, trust me. She looked at him. This man who'd bought her, taught her, protected her, who kept his rifle by the door and his grief locked in a trunk, but who'd shown her nothing but patience and care, who'd said he was proud of her, who was willing to abandon his home to keep her from being dragged back into darkness. I trust you, she said. They packed quickly. Essentials only, enough for a few days. Food, blankets, changes of clothes, Calder's rifle and ammunition, the small tin of salve that had become precious to Mara. She climbed to the loft and looked around at the space that had become hers. The quilt, the window overlooking pines, the bar that had once meant safety and now hung unused because she'd learned to trust the man below. She descended and found Calder by the locked trunk. His hand rested on the dark wood, his face shadowed. Leaving this behind too, he said quietly. If they burn the cabin out of spite, better it goes than Sarah and Clara go with us. Will they really burn it? Men like your father do spiteful things when they feel wronged, and men like that sheriff do whatever they're paid to do. He straightened, visibly pulling himself together. Come on, we've got a ride ahead of us. They left in full darkness, the wagon loaded, the cabin locked behind them. Calder had scattered extra grain for the chickens, left the horses loose in the barn with food and water, banked the fire to coals that would die safely. The clearing looked peaceful in the moonlight, innocent, as if trouble wasn't headed toward it with the dawn. The ride to Elias's place took 4 hours through snow and darkness, the trail treacherous but passable. Calder drove with practiced ease, the rifle across his lap, his attention split between the horses and their surroundings. Mara sat beside him wrapped in blankets, watching the forest pass in silver and shadow. I'm sorry, she said at one point. For what? For bringing this trouble to you. If you hadn't bought me, then you'd be trapped in Ridgewater, or worse, and I'd still be alone in that cabin, pretending isolation was the same as peace. He glanced at her. I chose this, Mara. Every bit of it. No regrets. Even if they burn your home? It's wood and nails, can be rebuilt. You're irreplaceable. The words settled into her chest, heavy and warm, precious beyond measure. They arrived at Elias's homestead well past midnight. Lights still burned in the main house, and Elias himself emerged onto the porch as they pulled into the yard, a rifle in his hands until he recognized them. Trouble came faster than expected, he called. Jacob brought word. We're here for sanctuary. You've got it. Bring the wagon to the barn. You'll sleep in the house tonight. Inside, Elias's wife, a sturdy woman named Margaret, with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, had already prepared sleeping spaces. She took one look at Mara and wrapped her in a blanket that smelled of sage and wood smoke. You're safe here, child. Whatever comes tomorrow, you're safe. That night, Mara slept in a real bedroom with a door that locked from the inside, in a house full of people who'd offered protection without hesitation. She lay in the darkness listening to the murmur of voices from the main room, Calder and Elias, planning, discussing, preparing for what dawn would bring. Her father was coming with lies and weapons and the law twisted to serve his purposes. But he was coming to the wrong place, not to an isolated cabin where violence could happen unseen, but to a community that had already claimed her as one of their own. Mara closed her eyes and let herself believe for the first time that she might actually be free. Morning broke cold and bright. Mara woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, to the sound of children laughing, to Margaret humming as she worked in the kitchen. Normal sounds, safe sounds. She dressed and joined the others to find that word had spread overnight. Sarah Colton was there with her husband. Nell Rowan had ridden in at dawn. 3 other families from the gathering had arrived. Their wagons circled in Elias's yard like a fortress of witnesses. Calder stood on the porch with Elias, both men armed, both watchful. When Mara appeared, Calder's expression softened slightly. "Sleep?" "Some. You?" "Enough." He gestured to the assembled people. "Your father wants to make a scene. He'll have an audience. Let's see how his story holds up under scrutiny." They didn't have to wait long. Near mid-morning, 3 riders appeared on the southern trail. Even from a distance, Mara recognized her father's lean silhouette, the way he sat his horse with angry rigidity. The 2 men with him were strangers, one wearing a badge that glinted in the sunlight, the other carrying himself with the swagger of someone used to intimidating others. They rode into Elias's yard and stopped, taking in the assembled crowd, the armed men, the women and children watching from porches and wagon beds. The sheriff, if that's what he really was, spoke first. "We're looking for Thomas Hensley's daughter. We have legal papers authorizing her return to her father's custody." Elias stepped forward, his bearing commanding despite his age. "I'm Elias Running Fox. This is my land. State your business proper or turn around." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "I just did. We're here to recover a girl taken illegally from Ridgewater by that man." He pointed at Calder. "Calder Voss, accused of purchasing a minor child for immoral purposes." Mara felt the words like a physical blow. Around her, the crowd murmured, angry and disbelieving. Calder's voice cut through the noise, cold and level. "I paid fair trade for her keep, witnessed by half of Ridgewater. Her father sold her on the courthouse steps. Any immorality belongs to him, not me." Thomas Hensley finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "She's my daughter, my property, until she's 18 or married. You had no right." "I had every right once you put a price on her and accepted payment." Calder descended the porch steps slowly. "You took my money, my goods. The transaction's complete." "I'm contesting the transaction, claiming it was made under duress." "Whose duress? You were the one selling." The sheriff held up a hand. "Enough. I have papers signed by a county judge ordering the girl's return. Where is she?" Mara's heart hammered. Margaret's hand found hers, squeezed gently. Nell moved to stand beside her, a solid presence. Elias spoke again, his voice carrying authority. "Before we go any further, I'd like to see these papers. And I'd like to verify your credentials, Sheriff. You're a long way from county jurisdiction." The sheriff's face reddened. "My jurisdiction extends. Your jurisdiction ends at the treaty line, which is 5 miles south of here. This land falls under tribal territory governance recognized by federal law. You have no authority here unless I grant it." Elias extended his hand. "The papers, please." For a long moment, the sheriff didn't move. Then he reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Elias took it, unfolded it carefully, and read it with deliberate slowness. His expression never changed, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested contempt. "This is not a legal document," he said finally. "The signatures are wrong, the seal is irregular, and the language doesn't match territorial court standards. This is a forgery." "That's a lie," Thomas snarled. "No, this is a lie." Elias held up the paper. "And everyone here is a witness to your attempt to use falsified authority to reclaim a child you sold for profit." The deputy's hand moved toward his gun. Immediately, every man in the yard raised their weapons, not pointing, just ready. The message was clear. Violence would be met with overwhelming response. The sheriff saw the odds and went still. "This isn't over." "Yes," Calder said quietly, "it is. You came here with lies and forged papers to take a girl who doesn't want to go back. You failed. Now leave before I decide to press charges for trespassing, fraud, and attempted kidnapping." Thomas jerked his horse forward, his face twisted with fury. "She's my daughter!" "She was your daughter," Mara heard herself say. Her voice shook, but it carried. "Until you sold me. You gave up that right when you traded me for a rifle." She stepped forward, out of the house's shadow, and let them all see her. See the girl who'd left Ridgewater hunched and afraid, now standing straight. See the calloused hands, the clear eyes, the evidence of work and care and safety. "I'm not going back with you," she said. "Ever." Thomas stared at her with something like shock, as if seeing a stranger in his daughter's face. And maybe he was. The girl he'd sold wouldn't have spoken, wouldn't have stood in front of witnesses and claimed her own freedom. "You ungrateful—" "Enough!" The sheriff cut him off, his own calculation clear. This wasn't going to end the way they'd planned. "We'll take this to higher authorities. Get proper papers." "You do that," Elias said. "And when those authorities ask questions, tell them Elias Running Fox has documentation proving this land's status, witnesses to the original sale, and testimony from multiple sources about the girl's treatment and wishes. See how far your lies get you then." The three men sat their horses for another moment, weighing options. Then the sheriff wheeled his mount and rode south. The deputy followed. Thomas Hensley stayed a moment longer, his eyes locked on Mara. She met his gaze without flinching, without apology, just looked at him until he saw what he'd lost. Not property, but a daughter who might have loved him if he'd ever given her reason. Then he too turned and rode away, disappearing down the trail in a cloud of snow and defeat. The silence that followed felt enormous. Then someone laughed, a bright, relieved sound that broke the tension. Others joined in, and suddenly the yard filled with celebration, with backslapping and embraces, with the particular joy of community standing together against wrong. Mara stood rooted to the spot, trembling with adrenaline and relief. Calder crossed to her, moving through the crowd, and stopped a respectful distance away. "You all right?" "I think so. I told him no. I told him I wasn't going back." "I heard. You were brave." "I was terrified." "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway." He studied her face. "You meant it? What you said?" "Every word. I'm not his anymore. I'm—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I'm mine." Calder's expression shifted into something that might have been pride, might have been satisfaction, might have been the simple recognition of truth spoken aloud. "Yes," he said quietly. "You are." Around them, the mountain folk continued celebrating, sharing food and stories, reliving the confrontation with the embellishments that would turn it into legend. Elias approached, his weathered face creased in a smile. "That was well done, Miss Hensley. Your father won't trouble you again, and if he tries, he'll find every homestead between here and the border ready to testify against him." "Thank you," Mara said, "for everything. We look after our own, and you're one of us now, whether you knew it or not." He turned to Calder. "Your cabin should be safe. I doubt they'll risk more trouble after this, but you're welcome to stay here as long as you need." "Appreciate it. But I think we'll head home tomorrow. Let things settle." Home. Calder had called the cabin home, and Mara realized she thought of it the same way. Not the place she'd been taken, but the place she'd chosen to stay. That night, as Margaret served dinner to a table full of neighbors and friends, as children played and adults talked and laughter filled the warm house, Mara sat beside Calder and felt something shift in her chest. Some final piece of armor falling away, some last wall coming down. She was safe. She was free. She was surrounded by people who'd stood for her without hesitation. And tomorrow, she would go back to the cabin in the pines and continue building the life she'd barely begun to imagine, the life that was hers to define. They stayed at Elias's homestead for 3 more days while word spread through the territory about what had happened. Riders came and went, carrying news to distant neighbors, ensuring that everyone knew Thomas Hensley had tried to reclaim his daughter with forged papers and had been turned away by the community. The story grew with each telling. Some versions had 20 armed men in Elias's yard. Others claimed the sheriff had drawn his weapon and been disarmed, but the core remained the same. Mara Hensley had stood in front of witnesses and chosen her freedom. On the morning of the 4th day, Calder loaded their wagon and checked the horse's tack with the careful attention he gave everything. Mara helped Margaret wash the breakfast dishes, both women working in comfortable silence until Margaret set down her cloth and turned to face her. "You've got spine, girl," More than you knew, I'd wager. Mara dried a plate carefully. I was terrified the whole time. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. Margaret squeezed her shoulder. You're going to be all right. You've got good people around you now, and you've learned you can stand for yourself. That's everything. They embraced, and Mara felt tears prick her eyes. This woman had opened her home to a stranger, had stood beside her against armed men, had offered safety without conditions. The kindness still felt unfamiliar, precious in its unexpectedness. Elias walked them to the wagon, his weathered face thoughtful. You head straight home. Don't linger on the trail. I don't expect trouble, but caution never hurt anyone. Will do, Calder said, shaking his hand. And Voss, what you did, stepping in when you saw wrong, that took character. Not many men would have done it. Elias paused. But now you've got responsibility. That girl trusts you. Don't make her regret it. I won't. See that you don't. Elias turned to Mara. You're always welcome here. Any time, any reason. Remember that. I will. Thank you. The ride back to the cabin took most of the day, the wagon following the now familiar trail through snow and forest. The sky was sharp blue overhead, the air cold enough to freeze breath, but the sun provided enough warmth to make the journey bearable. They traveled in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts, until the clearing finally came into view in late afternoon light. Everything stood exactly as they'd left it. The cabin sat peaceful in its ring of pines, smokeless and quiet. The barn doors were closed, the chicken coop undisturbed. No signs of violence, no evidence that Thomas and his hired men had circled back to cause harm. Calder set the brake and sat for a moment, studying the scene. Looks untouched. Did you think they'd burn it? Crossed my mind. Men do spiteful things. He climbed down and offered his hand to help her from the wagon. This time, she took it. Let's check inside. The cabin was cold but intact. Calder built up the fire while Mara checked the loft, the cupboards, the corners. Nothing disturbed, nothing taken. Just the same space they'd left in darkness and fear, now returned to in daylight and relief. While Calder tended the horses and checked on the chickens, who'd survived their abandonment with ruffled dignity, Mara unpacked their things and started a pot of coffee. By the time he returned, the cabin was warming and the familiar smell of brewing coffee filled the air. They stood together by the fire, warming their hands, neither quite ready to speak. Finally, Calder broke the silence. Things are going to be different now. Mara looked at him. How? The whole territory knows about you. Knows you're here, knows the circumstances, knows you stood up to your father. You're not hidden anymore. That brings attention, questions, expectations. He paused. People will be watching to make sure you're treated right, and they'll have opinions about what that means. Are you worried about that? I'm practical about it. We've been living isolated, just the two of us working the homestead. But you're 16, and I'm a grown man with a past. Folks are generous now because you were rescued and protected. But as time passes, as you get older, the questions will change. People will wonder about intentions, about propriety, about what happens next. Mara's stomach tightened. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to think ahead, figure out what this arrangement actually is, and make sure everyone understands it, including us. Calder moved to the table and sat down, his expression serious. I brought you here to keep you safe, to give you a place to work and learn without being sold or abused. That was the purpose, and that hasn't changed. But you're not a child, Mara. You're becoming a young woman with your own mind and your own future. At some point, you'll need to decide what that future looks like. I know what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like going back to Ridgewater or being under my father's control. Agreed. But that's defining yourself by what you're running from, not what you're running toward. He leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. I'm not your father, and I'm not your husband. I'm something in between, a guardian maybe, or a teacher, but that's a temporary position. Eventually, you'll grow past needing either. The words should have been liberating. Instead, they felt like loss. Are you saying you want me to leave? No, I'm saying I want you to choose, to understand that staying here is a choice you can make freely, same as leaving would be. And I want you to think about what you want beyond just safety, because you deserve more than survival. Mara sat down across from him, her mind spinning. What if I don't know yet? What if I'm still figuring out who I am? Then you take the time to figure it out. There's no rush. His voice gentled. I just don't want you to wake up one day and realize you traded one form of captivity for another, even if this one's gentler. You need to know you have options. What options? I have no money, no family willing to take me, no prospects. You have skills now. You can work land, handle animals, manage a household. You're learning to read better, to calculate. Come spring, if you wanted, we could look into apprenticing you somewhere. With Nell, learning healing, or with one of the families who do weaving or preserving. You could learn a trade that would let you support yourself independently. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Independence. Real independence, not just safety borrowed from someone else's strength. And if I wanted to stay here, keep working the homestead? Then we formalize it. Draw up papers making you an official hired hand with wages, even if those wages go into savings for your future. Make it clear to everyone that this is an employment arrangement with proper boundaries. Protect both of us from speculation. Mara studied his face, trying to understand what he wasn't saying. You've thought about this a lot. I've had time to think. These past few days at Elias's place, watching people watch us, hearing the careful questions. They're supportive now, but support can turn to suspicion if we're not careful. I won't have your reputation damaged because I didn't plan properly. My reputation, Mara said slowly, was damaged the day my father sold me on the courthouse steps. Nothing that happens here could make that worse. You'd be surprised what people can make worse when they put their minds to it. Calder stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. I've lived alone for years, Mara. Didn't care what people thought because I had no one to protect but myself. But now I do, and I take that responsibility seriously. Something in his voice made Mara's chest tighten. You really think people will talk, even after what happened? People always talk. We just need to make sure they're talking about the right things, about how you're thriving, learning, building a future, not about impropriety or questionable arrangements. He turned back to her. I want you to have a life that's yours, free and clear, whatever that looks like. They were quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling and the coffee growing cold on the stove. Finally, Mara spoke. I want to stay, at least through winter, maybe through spring. I want to keep learning, keep getting stronger. And then I want to decide what comes next from a position of capability, not desperation. Calder nodded slowly. That's reasonable. We'll make it work. And the papers? The formalization? We'll draw them up when Nell visits next. She's witnessed enough contracts to know what's proper. We'll make it legal and clear. Mara felt something settle in her chest. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but a sense of things being addressed honestly. Thank you for thinking ahead, for caring about my future. It's what any decent person would do. No, Mara said firmly. It's what you do. A decent person would have stopped at buying me. You're teaching me to be free. Calder's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then learn well. It's the most important lesson. The winter deepened through December into January, and life at the cabin fell back into its rhythms. Calder taught Mara to shoot, setting up targets in the clearing and patiently correcting her stance, her breathing, her trigger discipline. At first, the rifle's kick bruised her shoulder and the noise made her flinch. But gradually, she learned to anticipate the recoil, to exhale before firing, to see the target as a problem to solve rather than an enemy to fear. Why do I need to know this? She asked one afternoon after successfully hitting a mark from 50 paces. Because skills equal options. You can shoot, you can hunt. You can hunt, you can feed yourself. You can feed yourself. You're not dependent on anyone's charity or goodwill. He reloaded the rifle and handed it back to her. Again, this time from 70 paces. She learned to track game through snow, reading the signs animals left behind. The distinctive prints of deer and elk, the scattered feathers where a hawk had taken a rabbit, the scratches on bark where a bear had marked territory. Calder taught her to move quietly through the forest, to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder in it. In the evenings, he taught her mathematics beyond simple addition and subtraction, how to calculate compound interest, how to measure land, how to estimate timber yields and livestock value. He taught her to read contracts, to spot deceptive language, to understand the difference between what was promised and what was guaranteed. "Why all this?" she asked one night, looking up from a particularly dense paragraph about property rights. "Because ignorance makes you vulnerable. Men take advantage of people who can't read the fine print, who don't understand numbers, who can't calculate their own worth." He tapped the contract. "You're never going to be that person. You're going to be the one who reads everything twice and trusts nothing until you verify it yourself." Mara bent back to the contract, working through the archaic language, and felt a fierce satisfaction when she identified the clause that would have cheated the signer out of water rights. Calder was right. Knowledge was armor. The more she learned, the harder it would be for anyone to deceive or control her. Nell visited twice through the winter, each time bringing supplies and news from the wider territory. On her second visit in late January, she brought the papers Calder had mentioned. A formal employment contract that specified Mara's duties, established a modest wage to be held in trust until she reached majority, and clearly defined the boundaries of the arrangement. Nell read through the document carefully, made 2 small corrections to the language, then had both Mara and Calder sign while she witnessed. When it was done, she folded the papers and tucked them into her coat. "I'll file these with Elias. He keeps records for the Mountain families since most of us don't trust the county clerk." She looked at Mara seriously. "This protects you both. If anyone questions the situation, there's legal documentation of proper employment. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Nell's expression softened slightly. "How are you doing, really? Not just physically, but in yourself?" Mara considered the question. "Better than I've ever been. Stronger, more capable. Sometimes I catch myself forgetting to be afraid, and that feels strange." "That's called healing. Takes time to trust it." Nell squeezed her hand. "Keep growing, keep learning, and don't let anyone tell you there's limits on what you can become." After Nell left, Mara climbed to the loft and sat on her bed, thinking about the contract now filed safely away. A piece of paper that said she mattered, that her work had value, that she was building towards something beyond mere survival. It felt like a foundation, something solid to build on. February brought deep cold and heavy snows that sometimes kept them inside for days at a time. During those stretches, Calder taught Mara to play cards, to work leather, to maintain tools and weapons. They read aloud from the few books he owned, agricultural manuals, some poetry, a novel about the sea that Mara found fascinating despite having never seen an ocean. One night, during a particularly fierce storm, Calder finally opened the locked trunk. Mara was mending a shirt by the fire when she heard the creak of hinges. She looked up and saw him kneeling beside the trunk, the lid raised, his hands hovering over the contents as if afraid to touch them. "Calder?" "Thought it was time," he said quietly. "Been carrying this weight for years. Maybe it's time to set some of it down." He lifted out a dress first, pale blue fabric, carefully folded, yellowed slightly with age. Then a smaller dress, child-sized, with embroidered flowers along the hem, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, a wooden toy horse carved with loving detail, a daguerreotype in a tarnished frame showing a young woman with dark hair and a serious expression, holding a small girl on her lap. "That's Sarah," Calder said, gesturing to the photograph. "And Clara. She was 4 when this was made, died when she was 7. Mara set down her mending and moved to sit beside him. They were beautiful. They were everything. His voice was rough with old grief. Sarah was a teacher before we married, smart, determined, stubborn when she believed in something. Clara had her mother's eyes and her father's terrible sense of humor. She'd make up songs about the chickens, give them all names and personalities. He ran his fingers over the wooden horse. I carved this for her 3rd birthday. She carried it everywhere, talked to it like it was real, found it in the ashes after the fire. It was about all that survived intact." Mara's throat ached. "I'm sorry you lost them." "Me too. Every day, me too." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "For a long time, I thought opening this trunk would destroy me, that seeing these things would bring it all back and I'd drown in it. But sitting here now, looking at Sarah's dress and Clara's toy, I just feel—" He paused, searching for words. "Sad, but not destroyed. Just sad that they're gone and grateful I had them at all. That sounds like healing too. Maybe. He carefully replaced the items, arranging them with gentle precision. But he didn't close the lid this time. Left it open, the contents visible, no longer locked away. I think Clara would have liked you. You've got her stubbornness. Sarah would have liked you too. She always rooted for people finding their strength. Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she simply sat with him in the firelight, honoring the silence, bearing witness to grief that had finally softened enough to be spoken aloud. March arrived with hints of thaw, dripping icicles, patches of bare ground appearing in the clearing, the first brave crocuses pushing through snow. The cabin felt less like a fortress against winter and more like a home preparing for spring. Mara and Calder began planning the garden, discussing what to plant, where to expand, what new skills she might learn during the growing season. One afternoon, while Mara was checking the chickens, she found something that made her call for Calder with urgency. He came running, rifle in hand, then stopped when he saw what she was holding. A hawk. Young, maybe a year old, with a broken wing and blood matting its feathers. It had crashed into the chicken wire and couldn't fly, could only drag itself in circles, eyes wild with pain and fear. "It's hurt," Mara said unnecessarily. Calder knelt beside the bird, studying it with practiced assessment. "Wings broken. Might be internal injuries too. Kindest thing would be to put it down quick. Can't we try to help it?" "Mara, wild things don't usually survive this kind of injury. Even if we set the wing, it might not heal right. And a hawk that can't hunt properly won't last long." "But we could try. Please!" Calder looked at her, then at the hawk, then sighed. "All right, but you're doing the work. I'll show you how, but you're the one who has to commit to it. Feeding it, cleaning it, keeping it calm while it heals. That's all on you." "I can do it." They built a small enclosure in the barn, lined it with straw, set up perches at varying heights. Calder showed Mara how to immobilize the wing with splints and careful wrapping, how to handle the bird without getting slashed by talons, how to feed it strips of raw meat on a stick to keep her fingers safe. The hawk, Mara started calling it Grace, though Calder said she was being ridiculous, naming something that would fly away the moment it could, was a difficult patient. It screamed and struggled, refused food for 2 days, attacked anything that came near. But slowly, day by day, it began to tolerate Mara's presence, began to eat from her stick, began to watch her with slightly less hostility and slightly more curiosity. "Why Grace?" Calder asked one evening as Mara prepared the hawk's dinner. "Because grace is what you give when something's broken. You gave it to me. I'm giving it to her." Calder was quiet for a long moment. "That's a good reason." Through late March and into April, Mara tended the hawk while helping Calder prepare for planting season. They turned the garden soil, repaired fences weakened by snow weight, cleaned and organized the barn. The work was constant and demanding, but Mara had grown strong enough to meet it. Her arms no longer ached after splitting wood. Her hands wielded tools with confidence. Her body moved through tasks with efficient certainty. One morning, she woke to find the loft bathed in golden light, the window open to air that smelled of pine and thawing earth. Spring had truly arrived. She dressed and climbed down to find Calder already outside, standing in the clearing with his face turned to the sun. "First real warmth," he said when she joined him. "Means we'll need to start planting within the week." "I'm ready." He looked at her, really looked, the way he had that first day in Ridgewater, but without the careful distance. What he saw seemed to satisfy him. "Yes, I believe you are." They worked through the morning, plotting garden rows, sorting seeds, planning the season ahead. Around noon, a rider appeared on the trail, one of Elias's sons, bringing news. "There's going to be a gathering," he called as he reined in. "Not just mountain folk this time. Some folks from Ridgewater, too. Word is, there's questions about what happened with Thomas Hensley's daughter, and folks want to hear the truth from witnesses." Calder's expression hardened. "When?" 3 days from now. Pa says you should come. Says it's important that Mara speaks for herself, lets people hear her story direct. Stops rumors before they spread further." Mara felt her stomach drop. "I have to go back to Ridgewater?" "No," the young man said quickly. "Gatherings at Pa's place, like before. but some Ridgewater families are coming out, wanting to verify what they've heard. It's not hostile, just curious. And Pa thinks it's better to answer questions in the open than let speculation fester. Calder looked at Mara. Your choice. We can go, or we can stay here and let Elias speak for us. Mara thought about her father, about the loading platform where she'd been sold, about the eyes that had watched without intervening. She thought about the girl she'd been then, silent, ashamed, believing she deserved what she got. She wasn't that girl anymore. We'll go, she said. I'll speak for myself. The gathering 3 days later was larger than the winter one had been. Wagons crowded Elias's yard, people clustered in groups talking and speculating, children running between adults with the energy of spring freedom. Mara recognized several faces from Ridgewater, the store owner's wife, the blacksmith, a few families who'd attended church socials. They looked at her with undisguised curiosity, some with sympathy, others with the kind of judgment that assumed they understood her situation better than she did. Elias had organized the gathering with deliberate structure. He stood on his porch and called everyone to attention, his voice carrying authority that silenced conversations. We're here because there's been talk. Talk about Thomas Hensley's daughter, about Calder Voss, about what's proper and what's not. Talk spreads like wildfire, and most of it's got more smoke than truth. So we're going to settle this today with facts and witnesses. Anyone who wants to question the situation can do so openly. Anyone who has testimony to offer can speak. And most important, the girl herself will have her say. He gestured to Mara. Miss Hensley, if you'd step forward. Mara's legs felt like water, but she walked to the porch and climbed the steps. From this height, she could see the entire gathered crowd, maybe 60 people, their faces a mix of interest, concern, skepticism, support. Elias spoke gently. Tell them what happened. Start with the day you were sold. Mara took a breath and began. She told them about standing on the loading platform, about her father's auction, about Calder stepping forward with payment. She described the first night at the cabin, the locked loft, the promises made and kept. She talked about learning to work, to shoot, to read contracts, about the formal employment papers now filed with Elias. She spoke about her father's attempt to reclaim her with forged documents, about choosing to stay, about building a future defined by capability rather than fear. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. By the time she finished, she was speaking clearly, firmly, meeting eyes throughout the crowd. I'm not a captive, she said. I'm not being held against my will or abused or exploited. I'm working for wages, learning skills, and deciding my own future. That's all. Silence held for a moment. Then Mrs. Brennan from Ridgewater's general store stepped forward. I saw the sale, she said, her voice thick with old regret. Stood there and watched Thomas Hensley sell his daughter like she was livestock. Didn't stop it, to my shame, but I saw everything, and I can testify that what she's saying is true. He put a price on her, and Calder Voss paid it fair. The blacksmith spoke next. I've known Thomas Hensley 15 years. Man's got a mean streak and a drinking problem. Whatever that girl suffered in his house, I guarantee it was worse than anything she's facing now. One by one, witnesses came forward. People who'd seen the sale, people who'd heard Thomas brag about getting a good price, people who'd visited the cabin and seen Mara healthy and working. Nell Rowan testified about the employment contract, about the proper boundaries she'd verified, about Mara's physical and mental well-being. Finally, a woman Mara didn't recognize stepped forward. She was middle-aged, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone used to being heard. I'm Catherine Winters. I run a school for girls in the territorial capital. I came here specifically because I heard about this situation and wanted to assess it for myself. She looked directly at Mara. I've interviewed people in Ridgewater, spoken with families here in the mountains, and observed this young woman carefully today. In my professional opinion, she's been rescued, not exploited. And furthermore, she's exactly the kind of girl my school exists to serve, intelligent, capable, and in need of opportunities to develop her potential. Mara's breath caught. Catherine continued, addressing the crowd now. I'd like to offer Miss Hensley a place at my school, if she's interested. Full scholarship, room and board included. She'd receive education in literature, mathematics, sciences, and practical arts. Upon graduation, she'd be qualified to teach, manage a business, or pursue any number of respectable professions. The offer hung in the air like a gift and a test. Mara felt Calder's eyes on her, felt the weight of choice pressing down. Before she could respond, Elias spoke. "That's generous, Mrs. Winters, but maybe give the girl time to consider. This is a lot to take in." "Of course. I'll be staying in the area for a week. She can send word when she's decided." Catherine smiled at Mara. "You have potential, Miss Hensley. Don't waste it." The gathering broke into smaller conversations after that, the formal testimony complete. People approached Mara with questions, advice, offers of support. It was overwhelming. Too many voices, too many opinions, too much pressure to be grateful and decisive and perfect. Finally, Calder appeared at her elbow and quietly extracted her from the crowd. They walked to the barn, where the horses were stabled, and stood in the relative quiet. "That was unexpected," he said. "The school offer?" "All of it. But yes, especially that." He leaned against a stall door. "It's a good opportunity. Real education, connections, a path to independence that doesn't rely on homesteading or manual labor." "You think I should go?" "I think you should consider it seriously. It's exactly what I meant when I said you needed options." Mara felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't want to leave." "I know, but sometimes what we want and what we need are different things." His voice was gentle. "The cabin will always be there, Mara. I'll always be there. But opportunities like this don't come often. You're smart enough to benefit from formal education and young enough that it could open doors you can't even imagine yet. But what if I go and I fail? What if I'm not good enough? Then you'll have learned something valuable about yourself and the world. But I don't think you'll fail. I think you'll excel because you're stronger and more determined than you realize." Mara wiped her eyes roughly. "When did you become wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just a man who's lived long enough to know that potential unused is potential wasted, and you've got too much potential to spend it all in my cabin." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the horses shift and blow, to the distant sounds of the gathering continuing outside. Finally, Mara spoke. "Can I think about it? Really think? Without pressure?" "Take all the time you need. Mrs. Winters isn't leaving for a week." That night, back at the cabin, Mara climbed to the loft and lay in the darkness, her mind churning. Education. Independence. A future that extended beyond these mountains, beyond the rhythms she'd come to love. It was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. She thought about the girl who'd stood on the loading platform 6 months ago, and about the young woman she'd become. Thought about what she owed Calder, not debt in the sense of obligation, but in the sense of honoring what he'd given her by using it fully. In the morning, she'd check on Grace the hawk, whose wing had healed enough that she'd started testing it with careful flaps. Soon, Grace would be ready to fly, ready to leave the safety of the barn for the vast uncertainty of the open sky. Mara understood exactly how that felt. The week that followed felt suspended between two futures. Mara worked the homestead with Calder, preparing soil and planting early crops, but her mind kept drifting to Catherine Winters's offer. Education. A school for girls. A path toward something beyond survival. Beyond even competence, toward mastery, toward possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Each morning she tended Grace, watching the hawk grow stronger. The wing had healed remarkably well, the bone knitting clean, the flight feathers growing back in straight and true. Grace could hop from perch to perch now, could spread her wings without obvious pain, could grip Mara's leather-wrapped arm with talons that had regained their crushing strength. "She's almost ready," Calder observed one morning, watching the hawk preen. "Another week, maybe 2, and she'll be strong enough to hunt on her own." "I know." Mara stroked the hawk's chest feathers gently. "Part of me wants to keep her, make her a permanent resident, build her a bigger enclosure." "That would be cruel. She's wild. Belongs in the sky, not in a cage, no matter how comfortable." He paused. "Even if you love something, sometimes the kindest thing is to let it go." Mara understood he wasn't just talking about the hawk. That afternoon, she rode down to Elias's place alone. Calder had offered to accompany her, but she'd declined. This was a decision she needed to make without his steady presence as anchor or crutch. Catherine Winters was staying in the guest room of Elias's house. She received Mara in the main room, offering tea and settling into a chair with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to important conversations. "I'm glad you came," Catherine said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I needed to ask questions before I could decide." "Intelligent. Ask away." Mara had prepared her questions carefully, writing them down in the notebook Calder had given her for practicing letters. "What exactly would I study, and for how long?" "The standard course is 3 years. First year covers foundational academics, advanced reading, composition, mathematics through geometry, natural sciences, history. Second year adds practical skills, accounting, contract law, public speaking, teaching methodology. Third year is specialized. You choose a focus area like literature, sciences, or business management, and you complete a capstone project demonstrating mastery. And after graduation? You'd have multiple options. Many of our graduates become teachers. We place them in schools throughout the territory. Some go into business, managing shops or helping their families' enterprises. A few have gone on to study medicine or law, though those paths require additional education back east. One of our recent graduates started a successful publishing venture in Denver. Mara absorbed this, her mind spinning with possibilities. What about cost? You mentioned a scholarship, but what does that cover exactly? Everything: tuition, room and board, books and supplies, even clothing allowances for appropriate dress. The scholarship is funded by a widow named Harriet Chambers, who believes girls from difficult circumstances deserve opportunities for advancement. She was sold into an arranged marriage at 15, spent 20 years building a fortune with a husband she'd never met, and when he died, she dedicated herself to ensuring other girls had choices she'd lacked. The story resonated with painful familiarity. What would I owe in return? Nothing monetary. The expectation is that you'll work hard, graduate successfully, and use your education to support yourself and perhaps help other women in turn. Some graduates donate to the scholarship fund once they're established. Others volunteer as tutors or mentors, but there's no contract, no binding obligation, just an expectation of good faith. Mara looked down at her work-roughened hands, at the calluses that marked months of splitting wood and hauling water. "I'm not like the other girls there, am I? They come from different backgrounds." Catherine didn't soften the truth. Most come from middle-class families who've fallen on hard times. Widows who can't support daughters alone, fathers who lost businesses, families displaced by war or drought. You'd be one of the few who came from true poverty and abuse. But that's not a disadvantage, Mara. If anything, it means you understand the stakes of education in a way privileged girls never will. Would I fit in? That depends on you. Some girls might look down on your background. Others will admire your resilience. The faculty judges students on merit, not pedigree. If you work hard and prove yourself, you'll earn respect. Catherine leaned forward. But I won't lie. It will be difficult. You'll be behind in some subjects, ahead in others. You'll face girls who've never split kindling or butchered a chicken, who think hardship means their tea was lukewarm. You'll have to decide whether to educate them about reality or simply focus on your own growth. And if I can't handle it, if I need to leave, then you leave. No shame, no punishment. We'd help you find employment or return you to wherever you consider the home. But I don't think you'll quit, Mara. I've seen quitters. You're not one of them. The conversation continued for another hour, covering details about daily schedules, rules, and expectations, the other girls currently enrolled, the town where the school was located. Catherine answered every question with forthright honesty, neither overselling the opportunity nor underselling its challenges. Finally, Mara asked the question that had been circling her mind since the first mention of the school. Why me? You could offer this scholarship to any girl. Why come all the way out here for someone you'd never met? Catherine smiled, and for the first time Mara saw something personal in her expression. Because I heard about a girl who was sold like livestock and a man who stepped in to stop it. I heard about a community that stood up to corruption and a young woman who claimed her own freedom in front of witnesses. That story matters, Mara. It's the kind of story that changes how people think about what's possible. And I wanted to meet the girl brave enough to live it. Mara felt tears sting her eyes. I wasn't brave. I was terrified the whole time. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear because the alternative is worse. You stood on that porch and told your father no. That's the definition of courage. Catherine reached across and squeezed her hand. The scholarship is yours if you want it. Take your time deciding. But know that whatever you choose, I believe you have extraordinary potential. Mara rode back to the cabin in the golden light of late afternoon, her mind full of Catherine's words, her heart torn between gratitude and grief. The cabin appeared through the trees like a promise kept, solid, safe, familiar. Smoke rose from the chimney. The chickens scratched in their yard. Everything exactly as it should be. Calder was on the porch, sharpening tools, but he set down his whetstone when she dismounted. He didn't ask questions, just waited. She's offering everything, Mara said. Full education, room and board, connections to employment after graduation, no strings, no hidden costs, just an opportunity. That's generous. It's overwhelming. Mara tied Ash to the rail and sat on the porch steps. Part of me wants to say yes immediately, but another part feels like I'd be abandoning everything here. Abandoning you. You wouldn't be abandoning me. You'd be taking the next step in a journey I helped start. Calder sat beside her, close enough for comfort, but not crowding. I bought you time, Mara. Time to heal, time to grow, time to become strong enough to choose your own path. But I was always just the bridge between who you were and who you could become. The school. That's the destination. What if I'm not ready? You're as ready as you'll ever be. The rest you learn by doing. They sat in silence as the sun dropped toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Finally, Mara spoke the fear she'd been carrying. What if I go and realize I can't do it? What if I fail and have nowhere to come back to? Calder turned to look at her directly, his gray eyes steady and sure. This cabin will be here. I'll be here. If you need to come back for any reason, you're always welcome. That's not charity or obligation, it's just fact. You've earned a place here, and nothing changes that. Promise? Promise. The certainty in his voice broke something open in Mara's chest. She leaned against his shoulder and let herself cry, not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of possibility, of choice, a future spreading out like roads she could actually walk. Calder didn't try to stop her tears or tell her everything would be fine. He just sat solid and steady, letting her lean, letting her grieve the safety she'd be leaving behind, even as she reached for something bigger. When the tears finally subsided, Mara wiped her face and straightened. I want to go. I'm terrified, but I want to go. Then you'll go. Will you help me prepare? I don't know what I'll need, how to act, what to expect. We've got a month before the term starts. We'll spend it getting you ready. The next 4 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Calder helped Mara practice her reading and writing, pushing her through increasingly complex texts until she could parse dense paragraphs without stumbling. They worked on mathematics, on penmanship, on the kind of formal language used in educated circles. Nell visited and taught Mara basic etiquette, how to sit properly, how to eat with unfamiliar utensils, how to make polite conversation with strangers. You're not becoming someone else, Nell emphasized during one particularly frustrating lesson in table manners. You're just learning the language of a different world. You can choose when to use it and when to speak plainly, but knowing both gives you power. Sarah Colton brought fabric and helped Mara sew proper dresses. Nothing fancy, but clean and well-made, appropriate for a student. Margaret contributed a warm coat, barely worn, that had belonged to one of her grown daughters. Other mountain families sent small gifts, a hairbrush, a journal, writing supplies, a pair of sturdy shoes. The community was investing in her success, Mara realized, sending her forward as a representative of what was possible when people supported each other instead of tearing each other down. Through it all, she continued tending Grace. The hawk grew stronger daily, her wing fully healed, her hunting instincts sharp. Mara started taking her outside the barn, letting her perch on a long tether, watching her track birds overhead with fierce attention. Time's coming soon, Calder observed one morning. She's ready. Mara knew he was right, knew that keeping Grace caged when she could fly was cruelty disguised as love, but the letting go still hurt. 2 days before Mara was scheduled to leave for school, they took Grace to the high meadow above the cabin. It was a clear morning, the sky endless blue, the air sharp with pine and new grass. Mara wore her heavy leather glove, and Grace perched on her arm, head swiveling, eyes bright with anticipation. You sure about this? Calder asked. No, but it's right. Mara removed the tether with shaking hands. Grace shifted, testing her freedom, wings half spreading. For a long moment, the hawk simply sat, as if uncertain what to do without the familiar weight of restraint. Then she launched. The takeoff was powerful, clean, perfect. Grace's wings caught air and pulled her upward in strong, steady beats. She circled the meadow once, twice, gaining altitude, and Mara watched with her heart in her throat, tears streaming down her face. On the third circle, Grace broke away and flew north, toward the deeper mountains, toward freedom and wild sky, and a future only she would define. Mara stood with her arms still extended, the empty glove suddenly heavy, and felt Calder's hand on her shoulder. You gave her a second chance, he said quietly. That's everything. I'm going to miss her. Of course you are. But she's where she belongs now. Just like you'll be where you belong soon. They walked back to the cabin in silence, and Mara understood that she'd just practiced her own departure, that in 2 days she'd be the one flying away, leaving safety for the terrifying freedom of open sky. The night before she left, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in the loft listening to Calder move through his own restless evening routine and finally climbed down the ladder. He sat at the table, writing by lamplight. He looked up when she appeared. Can't sleep either? Too much in my head. She sat across from him. What are you writing? Letter to Catherine Winters, telling her to watch out for you, but also to push you hard. You'll rise to challenges if they're presented right. You think I'll do well? I think you'll do remarkably well once you find your footing. First few weeks might be rough. New place, new people, new expectations. But you're tougher than you look and smarter than you believe. You'll figure it out. Mara traced patterns on the wooden table. I'm scared I'll get there and realize I don't belong, that everyone else will be better prepared, more refined, more deserving. Probably some of them will be better prepared in some ways, but none of them will have survived what you've survived. None of them will understand hardship and resilience the way you do. That's worth more than polish. He set down his pen. And if anyone makes you feel lesser because of where you came from, remember that their opinion doesn't define your worth. Only you do that. You've taught me so much. How do I thank you for that? By using it. By becoming everything you're capable of becoming. By helping other girls when you're established the way you were helped. That's thanks enough. They talked late into the night, covering everything and nothing. Memories from the past months, advice for the future, small jokes and comfortable silences. Finally, as the fire burned low, Calder stood and moved to the locked trunk that hadn't been locked since the night he'd opened it months ago. He lifted out a folded quilt, the one Sarah had been making, patchwork squares in blues and greens stitched with careful love. I want you to have this. Mara's throat closed. I can't take that. It's Sarah's. Sarah would want it to be used, not stored away. And you need something from home to take with you, something that reminds you where you came from and where you can always return. He pressed the quilt into her hands. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme, and when Mara unfolded it, she found stitching along one edge. Initials and a date. SV 1862. Sarah Voss, making something beautiful in the middle of war and uncertainty. Thank you, Mara whispered. I'll take care of it. I know you will. She climbed back to the loft carrying the quilt, spread it across her bed, and finally fell asleep wrapped in the warmth of a woman she'd never met, but who'd been teaching her about grace and survival all along. Morning came too quickly. Calder loaded Mara's trunk into the wagon. All her belongings fit into one small chest, testament to how little she'd owned and how much she'd gained that couldn't be packed. The clothes Sarah and Margaret had helped make, the books Calder had given her, the journal from the mountain families, Sarah's quilt folded carefully on top. The ride to the stage stop took most of the morning. They traveled in silence, both lost in their own thoughts, until the small way station appeared, a rough building where the stage made weekly stops carrying passengers and mail to the territorial capital. Calder helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk to the loading area. The stage would arrive within the hour, the station agent assured them. Mara would reach the capital by evening, and Catherine Winters would meet her there. They stood in the dusty yard, and Mara felt panic rising. This was really happening. She was really leaving. I don't know if I can do this, she said suddenly. Yes, you can. You're just scared, which is normal. Calder took her shoulders gently, making her look at him. Listen to me. You stood on a loading platform and survived being sold. You climbed into a stranger's wagon, not knowing if you'd live through the night. You've split wood in snowstorms, faced down your father with armed men at his back, and nursed a wild hawk back to flight. You can absolutely handle a school full of girls and teachers. What if I forget everything you taught me? You won't. And if you do, you'll relearn it. Learning's a skill like any other, gets easier with practice. What if I'm lonely? Then you write me. I'm not much for correspondence, but I'll answer every letter. And you'll come back for visits, summer break, Christmas, if the weather allows. This isn't goodbye forever, Mara. It's just goodbye for now. The sound of hoofbeats and wheels announced the stage's approach. A cloud of dust rose on the road, and then the coach appeared, pulled by 6 horses, the driver calling them to a halt with practiced ease. Passenger for the capital? He called down. Yes, sir, Calder confirmed. The driver began loading Mara's trunk while Calder walked her to the coach door. She turned to face him, this man who'd bought her freedom and taught her to be free, who'd kept his promises and expected nothing in return except that she become herself. Thank you, she said, inadequate words for enormous debt. For everything. For saving me, for teaching me, for believing I could be more than what I was. You saved yourself. I just provided the space to do it. His voice was rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. Be brave, Mara. Be smart. Be kind. And come home when you need to. She hugged him then, properly, the way she'd never dared before, arms tight around his waist, face pressed against his chest, breathing in the familiar smell of pine and leather and wood smoke. He held her carefully, his hand gentle on her back. Right when you arrive, he said into her hair. Let me know you're safe. I will. She pulled back and climbed into the stage before she could lose her nerve. The coach was empty except for an elderly man dozing in the corner seat. Mara chose a window seat and looked out to find Calder still standing there, hat in hand, watching. The driver cracked his whip and the horses lurched forward. The stage rolled away from the way station, away from the mountains, away from the cabin that had been her refuge and her transformation. Mara watched through the window until Calder became a distant figure, then a speck, then disappeared entirely. She pressed her forehead against the glass and cried quietly, grieving what she was leaving behind even as she reached toward what lay ahead. The journey to the capital took 12 hours of rattling roads and dust and stops at way station after way station. Mara watched the landscape change, mountains giving way to foothills, foothills to rolling plains, wild country to settled farms. The world was so much bigger than she'd understood, full of places and people she'd never imagined. By the time they reached the capital, dusk had fallen and gaslights were being lit along the main street. The stage pulled into a busy depot crowded with travelers and freight, and Mara climbed out on shaking legs to find Catherine Winters waiting exactly where she'd promised. Welcome to Denver, Miss Hensley. How was your journey? Long, but I made it. Of course you did. I never doubted. Catherine gestured to a neat carriage waiting nearby. Come, let's get you settled. You must be exhausted. The school was located in a residential district, a large brick building with multiple floors and tall windows glowing with lamplight. Girls' voices drifted from the open windows, laughter and conversation blending with the clatter of dishes from what must be the dining hall. Catherine led Mara inside and up a staircase to the second floor, down a hallway lined with doors. She opened one near the end, revealing a small room with 2 narrow beds, 2 desks, a wardrobe, and a window overlooking a garden. You'll share with another new student, Elizabeth Chen, from a mining family in the mountains. She arrived this afternoon. The 2 of you can navigate being new together. A girl stood by the window, small and neat, with black hair pinned back and an expression of determined calm that Mara recognized from her own mirror. Elizabeth turned and offered a cautious smile. Hello, you must be Mara. Yes, and you're Elizabeth. They studied each other, 2 girls from hard backgrounds thrust together, both trying to project confidence they didn't entirely feel. Catherine excused herself to let them settle, promising to return for dinner. When the door closed, Elizabeth spoke first. Did you cry on the way here? I cried for 3 hours straight. The admission was so honest that Mara laughed despite everything. I cried too, all morning. We're probably going to cry a lot more before we figure this out. Probably. Elizabeth gestured to the beds. I took the left one, but I'll switch if you prefer. Left is fine. Mara set down the small bag she'd carried from the stage while her trunk was being delivered. Have you met any of the other girls yet? A few. Some are nice. Some looked at me like I was dirt on their shoes. I'm trying not to care, but it's hard. I know exactly what you mean. They talked while unpacking, sharing pieces of their stories. Elizabeth's father had died in a mine collapse. Her mother had worked herself to exhaustion trying to support 4 children. Catherine had found Elizabeth working in a laundry at age 14 and offered her the scholarship. Different details than Mara's journey, but the same core of hardship survived and opportunities seized. By the time dinner was called, they'd established an alliance. They'd watch each other's backs, help each other study, stand together against whatever condescension or difficulty came their way. The dining hall was full of girls, maybe 40 in total, ranging from Mara's age to early 20s. They sat at long tables, eating well-prepared food and talking with the ease of people who belonged. Elizabeth and Mara found seats near the end of one table and tried to look less overwhelmed than they felt. A girl across from them, blonde, polished, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Mara's entire trunk of belongings, smiled with calculated sweetness. You must be the charity cases. Welcome. I'm sure you'll find the adjustment challenging, but the faculty are very patient with students from difficult backgrounds. Elizabeth's face went tight with anger, but Mara surprised herself by responding calmly. We're scholarship students, yes, and I'm sure we'll manage the adjustment just fine. After all, we're used to working hard for what we get. The blonde girl's smile froze. A few other students snickered, and Mara realized she'd just passed some kind of test. Not making friends, necessarily, but establishing that she wouldn't be easily dismissed. That night, lying in her narrow bed with Sarah's quilt pulled up to her chin and Elizabeth breathing softly in the bed beside hers, Mara thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The loading platform in Ridgewater, the wagon ride into the mountains, the cabin with its locked loft, and the man who'd kept his promises. Grace the hawk, released to wild sky, Calder standing in the dust, watching her go. She pulled out the journal the mountain families had given her and wrote her first letter home. Dear Calder, I arrived safely. The school is intimidating and wonderful and terrifying all at once. I have a roommate who understands what it's like to come from hardship. Some of the girls are kind, some are cruel, all of them are watching to see if I'll fail. I won't. I'll make you proud. I'll make the mountain families proud. Most importantly, I'll make myself proud. Thank you for teaching me that was possible. I'll write again soon. Mara. She sealed the letter and set it on her desk to post in the morning. Then she lay back down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of a building full of girls settling into sleep, and felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. The first month at school was exactly as difficult as Catherine had warned. Mara struggled with subjects she'd never studied, felt constantly behind in literature and history, had to work twice as hard as other students to keep pace. Some girls were dismissive, others openly hostile, and the social hierarchies were as complex as anything she'd navigated in Ridgewater. But she also discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed. Her mathematics skills, honed by Calder's practical teaching, were excellent. Her writing, once she found her voice, was clear and powerful. And her willingness to work, to study late into the night, to ask for extra help, to push through frustration, earned grudging respect even from teachers who'd initially doubted her. Elizabeth became a true friend, and together they formed the core of a small group of scholarship students who supported each other through homesickness and academic challenges and the particular loneliness of being outsiders. Mara wrote to Calder weekly, telling him about her classes, her struggles, her small victories. His responses were brief but steady. Updates about the homestead, news from the mountain families, encouragement when she was discouraged and gentle teasing when she was too serious. Christmas break came and Mara traveled back to the mountains. The cabin looked exactly as she'd left it, down to the chest set on the table and the split wood stacked on the porch. Calder met her at the door with his usual quiet welcome, and for 2 weeks they fell back into familiar rhythms, work and chess games and evening conversations by the fire. You've changed, he observed one night. Carry yourself different, more confident. I've learned things about the world, about myself, about how much I didn't know. That's the best kind of learning. She told him about her classes, about the research paper she was writing on property rights for women, about her plans to focus on law and advocacy in her third year. Told him about Elizabeth and the other scholarship students, about the teacher who'd taken special interest in her writing, about the slowly shifting dynamics as other girls realized she wasn't going away. I'm proud of you, Calder said simply. You took a chance and made it work. Because you prepared me. Everything you taught me, the resilience, the self-reliance, the refusal to accept other people's definitions, that's what's getting me through. When break ended and she returned to school, the goodbye was easier than the first one had been. She knew now that the cabin would always be there, that Calder would always be steady, that home was a place she could return to rather than a place she was trapped in. The pattern continued through the next 2 years. Mara excelled academically, eventually graduating near the top of her class. She completed her capstone project, a comprehensive proposal for legal reforms to protect children from exploitation and trafficking that caught the attention of several territorial lawmakers. Upon graduation, she was offered a position with a women's advocacy organization in Denver, working to draft legislation and provide legal support to women and children in difficult circumstances. The work was demanding and often heartbreaking, but it felt right, using her education and experience to help others the way she'd been helped. She visited the cabin every few months, spending long weekends with Calder, helping with seasonal work and playing chess and catching up on life. The mountain community welcomed her back each time as one of their own, asking about her work, proud of her accomplishments. On one visit in late summer, 3 years after she'd first left for school, Mara and Calder sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains. The clearing was peaceful, the chickens settling for the night, smoke rising lazy from the chimney. I've been thinking, Calder said, about the locked trunk. What about it? I'm ready to let it go, not throw it away. Sarah and Clara will always be part of me. But I don't need to keep their things locked up anymore. Thought maybe we could donate the trunk and what's in it to Catherine's school. There's girls there who could use Sarah's dresses, and maybe knowing where they came from would mean something. Mara felt tears prick her eyes. That's a beautiful idea. You think so? I know so. Sarah would have wanted her things to help other girls, and Clara... She paused, thinking of the wooden horse, the small dress. Clara would have liked knowing she was still making a difference. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to appear. Finally, Mara spoke the question she'd been carrying for months. Do you ever regret it? Buying me that day? Taking on all the complications that came with it? Calder was quiet for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the gathering dusk. I regret that you had to be sold in the first place. Regret that the world's built in ways that let that happen. But regret bringing you here, teaching you, watching you grow into who you are now? He shook his head. No, that's been the best thing I've done in years, maybe ever. I used to think you saved me, Mara said softly, but I understand now that's not quite right. You gave me the space to save myself. There's a difference. There is, and you use that space well. They watched the stars emerge one by one, the familiar constellations appearing in their appointed places. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called, and another answered. The creek murmured its endless song. The world turned with patient certainty. Mara thought about the girl who'd stood on the loading platform in Ridgewater, hunched and afraid, believing she deserved what she got. Thought about Grace the hawk, released to wild sky. Thought about all the miles she'd traveled, literal and otherwise, to become the woman sitting on this porch, confident in her capabilities and clear about her purpose. She pulled Sarah's quilt tighter around her shoulders and made a silent promise to the woman who'd stitched it, to use what she'd been given, to help other girls find their wings, to honor the gift of freedom by living it fully. In the mountains, surrounded by pine and starlight and the steady presence of a man who'd kept his promises, Mara Hensley understood that she'd finally found what she'd been sold for. Not servitude or exploitation or diminishment, but herself. Whole, free, and finally home. 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 Finally home.